Step into the Edwardian era, roughly 1901 to 1914, a time when society looked like it had overdressed for literally everything. This was an age of elegance, of extravagant fashion, of social codes so rigid they could have doubled as building materials. It was also an age where your hat wasn't just an accessory, it was a billboard for your identity. Before you opened your mouth, shook someone's hand, or flashed a business card, your hat had already screamed your social rank, bank account, and possibly your moral character. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Imagine yourself walking down a fashionable London street in 1905. Men in frock coats, women in long skirts, sweeping up London's finest horse droppings, and everywhere hats. Not just hats, but towering symbols of wealth, taste, and social ambition. In Edwardian Britain, the first thing people noticed about you wasn't your smile, your handshake, or whether you smelled faintly of coal smoke. No, it was the real estate perched on your skull. Your hat told people everything they needed to know, and if it didn't tell the right story, good luck getting invited anywhere important. Why hats, though? Why not shoes or gloves or the size of your lapdog? The answer lies in visibility. Your shoes may have been muddy, your gloves could be hidden in a pocket, but your hat, that was front and center, towering above crowds, catching the light, and visible from half a street away. Hats were the social equivalent of a megaphone, and the Edwardians used them to broadcast status at maximum volume. In fact, many etiquette manuals from the time specifically noted that hats were the crowning glory of appearance. Subtle wordplay, yes, but also a sincere belief that your headgear literally crowned your social worth. Let's start with class. The Edwardian era was a society obsessed with hierarchy. Everyone wanted to know not just who you were, but where you ranked in the grand pecking order of wealth, nobility, or at least aspirational middle-class respectability. Hats made this instantly clear. A simple, practical cap, working class. A modest bonnet, lower middle-class respectability. A hat so enormous it could shade a small orchestra. Congratulations, you've arrived at the higher rungs of society, or at least your credit was good enough to fake it. It wasn't just about money. It was about character. In Edwardian eyes, a shabby hat meant a shabby person. A hat that was misshapen, dirty, or outdated was basically shouting, "I've given up on life." A neat, fashionable hat, on the other hand, meant you were respectable, disciplined, and serious about your place in society. People judged you before you even had a chance to open your parasol. One London newspaper sniffed that a poorly maintained hat betrays a poorly maintained mind. In other words, if your hat looked lazy, so did your soul. The Edwardian fixation on appearances was amplified by the fact that this was an era of display culture. The wealthy weren't just rich, they wanted you to know they were rich. Mansions, servants, carriages, and above all, fashion. Hats were one of the cheapest ways to climb the ladder of appearances. Though cheap is relative, since the most fashionable hats could still cost a working man's monthly wage, but for the ambitious middle class, investing in a hat was a shortcut to looking like you belonged in polite company. It was fashion as camouflage, with feathers. Let's not forget the theatre of public spaces. Edwardian cities, especially London, were designed for display. Wide boulevards, department stores, promenades, and parks all encouraged people to see and be seen. And what better way to be noticed in a crowd than by sporting a hat that could double as a mobile art installation? Hats weren't private. They were meant to be admired, envied, and judged. Walking through Hyde Park without a hat would be like showing up to a modern job interview in pajamas. Sure, you'd stand out, but for all the wrong reasons. Of course, the Edwardians loved rules, and hats came with plenty of them. It wasn't just wear a hat, it was wear the right hat. The right brim width, the right tilt, the right decoration for your age, marital status, and the time of day. Yes, time of day mattered. A respectable woman wouldn't be caught dead wearing her evening hat before sunset. It would have been as scandalous as wearing pajamas to Sunday church. The Edwardian era was basically one long dress code, and hats were the front line of fashion policing. This obsession had ripple effects. Think of young women entering society. Your coming out wasn't just about finding a husband, it was about announcing yourself with a perfectly chosen hat that declared, "Yes, I'm stylish enough to marry, and no, my family isn't broke." Hats were less accessories and more life strategies. The pressure was intense. One wrong choice could get you laughed out of a tea party, and social failure in Edwardian times was worse than a bad Wi-Fi connection today. And finally, we can't ignore the comedy of it all. Edwardians treated hats with deadly seriousness, but to us there's something wonderfully absurd about a society where success or failure hinged on whether your feathers drooped in the rain. Imagine balancing a giant brim in a stiff London breeze while trying to look dignified, or trying to maintain small talk at a garden party when your hat's shadow was blocking half the guest list. Edwardian hats were glamorous, yes, but also impractical, cumbersome, and sometimes laughably over the top. But then again, isn't that the point? If your hat didn't inconvenience you, were you even fashionable? So, as the Edwardian era opened, hats weren't just clothing. They were currency. They were theatre. They were instant resumes written in silk, felt and feathers. In a world where everyone wanted to know your worth at a glance, the hat was the quickest way to declare it. Whether you were truly wealthy or just very good at pretending, your headwear shouted your place in the grand parade of Edwardian society. And if you got it wrong, well, no amount of polite conversation could save you. If you thought Edwardian fashion was about subtlety, you're about to be flattened under a giant brim. By the early 1900s, hats had ballooned into architectural marvels, sometimes so enormous you wondered whether their wearers were still visible beneath. These were hats that didn't just accessorize an outfit. They declared war on physics. Wearing one was less fashion and more small-scale urban planning. The Edwardian obsession with size wasn't random. In a world obsessed with hierarchy, bigger almost always meant better. Big houses, big carriages, big banquets, and naturally big hats. The wider the brim, the taller the plume, the more space you occupied in the visual field of society, the more you seemed to matter. Small hat? Small influence. Massive hat with a brim so wide it knocked over glasses at the dinner table. Now you were someone worth paying attention to. This wasn't just about decoration. It was a form of social real estate. The hat literally carved out a bubble of personal space in crowded streets and drawing rooms. Imagine maneuvering through a busy promenade. Your wide-brimmed creation ensured no one could stand too close without being whacked by an artfully placed cluster of artificial roses. Hats became barriers as much as adornments, keeping the riffraff at bay. In a way, these hats were the Edwardian version of a VIP velvet rope. Don't get too close, I've paid good money for this radius. But how big are we talking? Some Edwardian hats stretched 2 feet across, rivaling small umbrellas. Newspaper caricatures mocked them as dinner tables strapped to women's heads. Photographs from the period show brims so broad they cast dramatic shadows over the wearer's shoulders, as if they carried portable gazebos. And if you're imagining delicate feather accents, think again. Entire arrangements of artificial fruit, silk flowers, lace veils, and if you had the budget, ostrich plumes were stacked on top. To modernize, it looks less like millinery and more like balancing an entire garden on your head. Of course, size created problems. The first and most obvious: doors. Trying to navigate a doorway while wearing a massive brim was like attempting to parallel park a horse-drawn carriage. Women often had to tilt sideways just to squeeze through. The second problem: seating. In theatres, the person behind you could wave goodbye to seeing the stage. In fact, so many complaints piled up that certain theatres actually posted signs banning overly large hats. Imagine dressing up in your towering masterpiece, only to be told you couldn't sit down because your head was blocking Shakespeare. Even conversation wasn't safe. Huge hats created what one satirist called a zone of muffled acoustics. You might lean in for a polite exchange at a garden party, only to find your words lost in the shadowy wilderness of feathers and lace. And heaven forbid it rained. Wide-brimmed hats caught raindrops like nets, turning into soggy, drooping disasters. Umbrellas plus wide-brim hats? Forget it. That combination was a duel waiting to happen. The inconvenience, however, was part of the point. Fashion thrives on impracticality. If you could afford to walk around in something that prevented normal life, it meant you didn't need to live normally. Working women didn't have the luxury of battling doors or ducking under chandeliers. They needed practical hats that stayed on their heads while they worked. Gigantic hats, therefore, were the privilege of those who lived lives of leisure. The more impractical the design, the louder it screamed, "I don't work for a living." This also explains why the largest hats were worn at society events, garden parties, horse races, and promenade walks. Wide-brimmed hats were outdoor spectacles, best displayed under sunlight where their shadows and feathers could dazzle. Indoors they were nuisances. Outdoors they were the equivalent of setting off fireworks above your head. These occasions turned into unofficial competitions. Who could balance the widest, most elaborately decorated creation without toppling over? Winning the hat race was almost as important as winning social favor. But size wasn't just vertical, it was horizontal. Wide brims created silhouettes that redefined the shape of Edwardian women's fashion. Photographers of the time noted how hats stretched the figure outward, emphasizing the long, slim S-bend corset shape popular in the period. The giant brim balanced the swan-like necks and tightly cinched waists, completing the look of aristocratic fragility. Without a hat, the silhouette was incomplete. With the wrong size, you risked looking squat instead of statuesque. So yes, your hat could literally make or break your body image. Naturally, humorists had a field day. Cartoonists sketched images of women taking out street lamps with their hats, or needing footmen to help them turn corners. In 1909, one American paper joked that soon milliners would need to provide traffic signals for women wearing the latest creations. In a world already jammed with carriages, omnibuses, and the occasional brave automobile, wide-brimmed hats added another obstacle to London's already chaotic streets. Yet, despite the impracticality and ridicule, Edwardian women loved their massive hats. They were empowering in their own way. A huge hat made you taller, broader, more imposing. It turned heads, literally, since people had to dodge around your brim to see anything else. It was a statement of confidence. Here I am, notice me. And in an era where women were fighting for more visibility, the oversized hat provided exactly that. So yes, size mattered in Edwardian hats. The bigger the brim, the higher the status, the louder the message. These hats were less about accessorizing and more about colonizing space, personal space, visual space, and social space. To wear one was to participate in a society-wide contest of grandeur, inconvenience, and self-display. Sure, you might knock over a vase or two, but wasn't that a small price to pay for announcing to the world that you were important? In the end, Edwardian hat gigantism was both absurd and brilliant, a mix of vanity, artistry, and competitive spirit. It turned fashion into performance, the street into a runway, and the head into a billboard of ambition. And if anyone dared suggest your hat was too big, you could simply tilt your brim, block them from view, and carry on ruling your personal 2-foot radius of space. If you were an Edwardian milliner, and your hat didn't look like it had recently dive-bombed an aviary, were you even trying? This was the golden age of feathermania, when no self-respecting fashionable headpiece was complete without a few plumes, a fan of ostrich fronds, or, if you really wanted to impress, the entire taxidermied body of a bird glued on top. If it had wings, Edwardians wanted it on their heads, alive or not. Feathers had long been used in European fashion, but the Edwardians turned it into an outright arms race, and just like all arms races, things got out of hand quickly. By 1905, it wasn't just about adding a decorative plume, it was about securing the rarest, most exotic bird parts possible. Birds of paradise from New Guinea, egrets from the Americas, kingfishers from Asia, all plucked, packed and shipped to European fashion houses. The more unusual the feather, the more your hat screamed exclusive. Forget diamonds. Feathers were the new precious gems, but there was a dark side to this avian extravagance. The demand for exotic plumage was so ravenous that bird populations across the globe suffered catastrophic declines. In South America and the Caribbean, entire colonies of snowy egrets were wiped out to satisfy Edwardian taste for their shimmering white plumes. Hunters would wait for nesting season, shoot the adult birds, and leave the chicks to starve. Also, a fashionable lady could look like she had a snowstorm erupting from her skull. Nothing says glamour like ecological collapse. The economics of feathers rivaled those of gold. A pound of top-quality egret plumes could cost more than a pound of gold. Ostrich plumes, imported largely from Africa, were so valuable that farms were set up specifically to harvest feathers without killing the birds, plucking them regularly like some horrific ongoing grooming session. Ostriches may have looked ridiculous running across the veldt, but in Edwardian London they were practically money on legs. Milliners relied on this global trade network to satisfy customers who demanded their hats come with the feathery equivalent of bragging rights. Naturally, the sheer absurdity of this craze didn't escape commentators of the time. Satirical cartoons showed women so weighed down with plumes they looked ready to take flight. One popular joke suggested ladies should be charged import tax as migratory birds when traveling abroad. Theatre reviewers complained they couldn't see the stage for the avian jungles blocking their view. Still, fashion laughed in the face of practicality, insisting that the more extravagant the feathers, the more elevated your social standing. And extravagance wasn't limited to plumes. Some hats didn't stop at feathers. They featured entire stuffed birds. Yes, people walked around with dead hummingbirds, owls, and songbirds perched on their heads, sometimes arranged in dramatic poses as though mid-flight. For us, that conjures up images of horror film props. For Edwardians, it was considered chic. Imagine sipping tea across from someone whose hat sported a lifeless sparrow frozen in eternal wing flap. Not unsettling at all. Feathers also tied into the Edwardian love of spectacle. Wide-brimmed hats, which we covered in the last chapter, were the perfect canvases for mounting feathery explosions. Ostrich plumes arched dramatically over the brim, creating halos of fluff that framed the face. Exotic feathers were dyed into shocking colors, reds, greens, blues, that announced both wealth and daring. A single plume could bounce jauntily with every step, giving the impression of perpetual motion. Hats didn't just sit on the head, they performed. This obsession had ripple effects in society. Hat shops, called millinery houses, competed fiercely to secure the best feathers. Wealthy women boasted about the origins of their plumes as though describing fine wines. Oh yes, this egret plume? Straight from the Florida swamps. Lesser mortals copied the trend as best they could, buying cheaper, dyed feathers from ducks, chickens, or geese. But everyone knew the difference, just as fake designer handbags betray themselves today. A cheap feather screamed bargain bin. To wear one was fashion suicide. The feather craze also spawned something unexpected, the beginnings of modern conservation activism. By the early 20th century, naturalists were horrified at the ecological carnage. Organizations like the Audubon Society in America began campaigning against plume hunting, exposing the brutality of the trade. Newspapers ran shocking stories of slaughtered birds and orphaned chicks. Some women, dubbed plume warriors, actually began boycotting feathers in protest. But during the height of Edwardian society, these voices were drowned out by the rustle of ostrich fronds at every garden party. For the fashionable, the more absurd the feather display, the better. Women would compete over who had the tallest plume or the rarest species. Walking into a ballroom was less about making an entrance and more about making sure your feather arrangement eclipsed everyone else's. Hats weren't just fashion, they were competitive sports equipment. Lose the feather game, and you lost face. Win it, and you left a trail of envious stares and possibly frightened pigeons. Of course, there was the practical nightmare of keeping feathers in place. Rain ruined them, wind tangled them, and moths adored them as midnight snacks. Owners invested in elaborate hat boxes, feather combs, and even plume restylers to keep their collections from drooping. A sad, limp feather was fashion death, so maintenance was almost as demanding as the initial purchase. It's hard to feel glamorous when your exotic bird starts shedding into your soup. Looking back, the Edwardian feather craze is both mesmerizing and absurd. It reflected the era's appetite for spectacle, its global reach in trade, and its utter indifference to practicality or sustainability. Hats became bird cemeteries worn with pride, fashion statements built on extinction, and yet, despite the cruelty and inconvenience, people adored them. For Edwardians, feathers weren't just decoration, they were trophies, proof of wealth, and tickets into the exclusive club of high society. So the next time you see a feathery fascinator at a modern wedding, remember, once upon a time, people nearly wiped out half the bird kingdom just to make sure their heads looked more interesting. Edwardian hats weren't fashion, they were an airborne empire, and the feathers were its spoils. If the Edwardian era had a mascot, it wasn't the dashing gentleman with his walking cane, or the elegant lady at a garden party. It was the ostrich. Yes, that gawky long-necked bird, more famous today for sprinting across the savannah or starring in awkward wildlife documentaries, was once the beating heart of a global fashion empire. Why? Because those luxurious, fluffy plumes sprouting from its tail were worth a fortune. An ostrich wasn't a bird. It was a walking ATM for the Edwardian hat market. Feathers were the gold standard of Edwardian fashion, but ostrich plumes were the diamond tier. Unlike delicate egret feathers which came at the cost of ecological devastation, ostrich feathers could be harvested repeatedly without killing the bird. This made them not only fashionable but renewable. At least renewable if you ignored the psychological trauma of being plucked like a living feather duster. An ostrich could produce marketable plumes 2 or 3 times a year, which meant a well-managed flock was basically a feathery money printer. The center of this booming trade, South Africa, the semi-arid Karoo region became the epicenter of the ostrich industry, where massive farms were established to breed, raise, and pluck these gangly creatures. Imagine acres of farmland not filled with cows or sheep, but with thousands of giant birds strutting around like nervous ballerinas. By 1910, ostrich farming was so profitable that land in the Karoo was said to be more valuable than land in central London. Farmers became millionaires practically overnight, their wealth built not on diamonds or gold mines, but on flamboyant headgear for London's socialites. This wasn't just a quirky niche market, it was a global obsession. By 1913, South Africa was exporting nearly 450,000 kilograms of ostrich feathers a year, worth the modern equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars. Feather auctions in London and Paris were as frenzied as stock exchanges, with buyers shouting bids for the longest, fluffiest plumes. The price of top-quality ostrich feathers rivaled precious metals, and farmers guarded their flocks with the same vigilance bankers guarded vaults. But ostriches are not exactly cooperative business partners. They bite, they kick, and they run at speeds faster than most horses. Farmers had to develop careful methods for handling them, often involving blindfolds, ropes, and teams of handlers who treated each plucking like a military operation. It was dangerous work, one wrong move, and you could find yourself on the receiving end of a bone-crushing kick. Yet the profits were so astronomical that no risk seemed too great. For many Edwardian entrepreneurs, a few broken ribs were just part of the feathered gold rush. And it wasn't just South Africa cashing in. Ostrich farms popped up in California, Australia, and even parts of the Middle East, all hoping to tap into the insatiable demand. In California, the ostrich ranches even doubled as tourist attractions, where visitors could gawk at the birds, buy feathers, and occasionally attempt the ill-advised stunt of riding one. Nothing screams Edwardian weekend getaway like being hurled off the back of a very angry ostrich. The ostrich feather craze reshaped economies. In South Africa, towns sprang up around the feather trade, with merchants, exporters, and shipping companies all riding the boom. Some farmers built lavish mansions called feather palaces to showcase their wealth. Their drawing rooms were stuffed with imported furniture, chandeliers, and, ironically, ostrich feather dusters. These millionaires owed their fortune not to industrial might or natural resources, but to the simple fact that fashionable Edwardian ladies wanted to look like migrating birds of paradise. But like all booms, this one was precarious. The ostrich feather market depended entirely on fashion staying obsessed with plumes. As long as enormous feathered hats remained in vogue, the money poured in. But fashion is fickle, and lurking on the horizon were storm clouds that would burst spectacularly in the 1910s. For now, though, ostrich farming was a license to print money. Families who'd been scraping a living from sheep suddenly found themselves sending their children to study in Europe, wearing diamonds bought with feather cash. The humor in all this practically writes itself. Imagine explaining to a modern banker that your £1,000,000 fortune comes not from stocks, bonds, or oil, but from regularly yanking the tail feathers of a 6-foot-tall bird that looks permanently confused. Ostrich farming was part fashion industry, part slapstick comedy, and part high-risk venture. These birds weren't docile chickens. They were unpredictable, violent, and hilariously uncooperative. If you managed to corner one long enough to extract its prized feathers, you deserved every penny. And the hats these feathers adorned, they were spectacular. Ostrich plumes had a natural bounce and softness that made them perfect for theatrical, oversized creations. A single plume could curl elegantly over a brim, sway dramatically with every step, and make the wearer look like they were always caught in a glamorous breeze. Unlike stiffer feathers, ostrich plumes had movement, and movement meant life. Edwardian women adored them, because nothing said wealth like looking as though you had a personal wind machine following you around. The ostrich feather craze also revealed just how global Edwardian fashion had become. A woman in London might wear a hat trimmed with plumes plucked in South Africa, shipped via Cape Town, sold at auction in Paris, and then shaped by a milliner in Mayfair. Each hat was a global enterprise condensed into one feathery halo. Your head wasn't just carrying decoration, it was carrying an international supply chain. By the height of the Edwardian era, ostriches weren't just birds anymore, they were commodities, investments and status symbols all rolled into one. Farmers became aristocrats, feathers became fortunes, and society women became the living billboards for an entire industry. It's hard not to marvel at the sheer absurdity of it all. Imagine walking through a South African ostrich farm and realizing that every awkward bird pecking at the fence is, in effect, a bundle of banknotes with legs. So yes, in Edwardian times, the ostrich was more than just a bird. It was a financial empire covered in fluff, a creature that made and broke fortunes and the ultimate proof that fashion can turn the strangest things into global obsessions. And as long as society craved hats that brushed the sky, the ostrich reigned supreme, not as king of the savannah, but as undisputed monarch of the millinery market. If Edwardian hats looked like portable jungles, circus tents, or small-scale architectural projects, that's because behind every feathered masterpiece was an army of milliners. These women, often anonymous, overworked, and underpaid, were the unsung engineers of fashion. Think sweatshop, but instead of sneakers, it was mountains of feathers and glue. Millinery was one of the few respectable professions available to working and lower middle-class women in the early 20th century. Across London, Paris, and New York, millinery shops ranged from tiny backroom businesses to glittering showrooms catering to aristocrats. But whether the client was a duchess or a shop girl, the labor behind the hat was the same: endless hours of cutting, stitching, steaming, wiring, and trimming. It wasn't glamorous. It was gritty, fiddly, eye-straining work. The process began with the foundation, the hat frame. These were made from buckram, a stiffened cotton or linen and wire, painstakingly bent into shape. A hat wasn't just plonked together, it had to be engineered, built layer by layer so it could withstand both the weight of elaborate decorations and the indignities of weather. Frames were stretched over wooden molds called blocks, heated with steam, and then shaped until they formed the perfect base. Milliners developed blistered hands from tugging fabric tight over these forms, because nothing was worse than a saggy brim. Once the skeleton of the hat was ready, the real artistry began. Fabrics like silk, velvet, and felt were carefully stretched, smoothed, and sewn into place. Milliners worked with terrifying precision. One crooked stitch could ruin the symmetry of the design, and Edwardian fashion tolerated mistakes about as well as it tolerated showing up bareheaded in public. The pressure was immense. Hats weren't cheap, customers expected perfection, and complaints could ruin a small shop's reputation overnight. Then came the trimmings, the part most people imagine when they think of Edwardian hats. This stage was where creativity flourished, but also where chaos ruled. Piles of feathers, ribbons, lace, flowers, both artificial and dried, beads, and even whole taxidermied birds cluttered milliners' tables. Milliners didn't just slap them on, they arranged these elements like painters working on a canvas. The trick was balance. Enough to dazzle, not so much it collapsed under its own weight. A hat was supposed to look exuberant, not like it was plotting to eat its wearer alive. Tools of the trade were humble: needles, thread, glue pots, curling irons for feathers, and the ever-present thimble. Milliners became masters of improvisation. Knead a plume to curl dramatically to the left, heat it, bend it, and stitch it down. Knead a flower to stand upright, wire it until it's practically an antenna. Hats weren't just sewn, they were sculpted, bent into submission, and coaxed into artistry by women whose wages rarely reflected the skill involved. The conditions in many workshops were less than ideal. Cramped, dimly lit rooms, long hours, and exposure to glue fumes and dyes were standard. Some apprentices worked 12 to 14-hour days for pennies, carefully stitching hats they could never afford to wear. Their backs ached, their eyesight suffered, but the demand never slowed. During peak fashion seasons, workshops hummed late into the night, their workers racing to meet orders for society weddings, race days, and debutante balls. The irony was sharp. While aristocratic women flaunted hats worth small fortunes, the women who made them often lived one missed paycheck away from poverty. Despite the grind, millinery also offered opportunities for creativity and advancement. Skilled milliners could rise through the ranks, eventually running their own shops. Famous names like Caroline Ribou in Paris became legends, shaping international fashion trends. Ribou pioneered the cloche hat that later defined the 1920s, but in the Edwardian years, her lavish creations graced the heads of Europe's elite. These high-profile milliners weren't just artisans, they were tastemakers. Their designs featured in magazines and sought after by royalty. Apprenticeship was the gateway into this world. Young girls, sometimes barely in their teens, were taken on as improvers and trained to stitch, trim, and decorate under the watchful eyes of older milliners. They started with simple tasks, hemming ribbons, sewing linings, and gradually graduated to feathers and flowers. The work was repetitive, but it taught them the discipline and dexterity needed to survive in an industry that demanded both speed and artistry. And then there was the politics of the workshop. Milliners worked shoulder to shoulder, gossiping, competing, and sharing tricks of the trade. They formed bonds, but also rivalries: who could finish the neatest stitches, who was fastest with trimming, who managed to get praise from Madame herself. For many working women, the millinery shop was a strange mix of factory floor and finishing school, teaching them skills, discipline, and a sense of camaraderie even as it drained their energy. For the customers, though, none of this mattered. All they saw was the end product, a dazzling confection perched on their head, as though the hat had spontaneously grown there overnight. The invisible labor of milliners disappeared beneath the glamour, much like the wiring and scaffolding hidden under a stage set. If the hat was perfect, nobody thought about the bent fingers and tired eyes that stitched it into being. And if it wasn't perfect, well, then everyone noticed. It's easy to laugh now at the absurdity of Edwardian hats, but the truth is, behind every absurd plume or oversized brim was a worker hunched over a workbench, sewing late into the night. These women stitched dreams out of fabric and feathers, creating objects that were both fashion statements and social passports. Their artistry fueled the obsession, even as their lives remained far from the elegance their creations represented. So the next time you see an Edwardian hat in a museum, an explosion of ostrich feathers, silk roses, and velvet bows, picture the workshop it came from. The glue-stained tables, the humming of sewing machines, the chatter of apprentices, the smell of steam and dye. Remember that the glamour on display was built not just from fabric and feathers, but from the uncelebrated labor of women who turned chaos into couture. In the Edwardian era, hats weren't just decorations, they were social telegrams. The moment you stepped outside, people didn't just see your hat, they read it. Every detail sent a message: how much money you had, how respectable you were, whether you were married, single, or perhaps scandalously widowed. Forget subtlety. If your brim didn't scream money, people assumed you were staff. This was a world obsessed with appearances and class boundaries. A hat wasn't an accessory. It was a declaration of who you were in the great Edwardian pecking order. Think of it as the early 20th century equivalent of Instagram bios. Were you married, mother of 3, respectable and church-going? There was a hat for that. Were you eligible debutante waiting to be noticed? There was a hat for that too. Usually bigger, flirtier, and dangerously close to poking someone's eye out at the dinner table. Let's start with money. Wealthy women paraded in hats dripping with expensive materials, silks, velvets, exotic feathers, even jewels sewn into trimmings. These weren't hats so much as portable bank accounts strapped to their heads. A duchess in Mayfair might wear something so extravagant it could pay a maid's wages for a year. The middle classes, desperate to climb the social ladder, invested in more modest versions. Good quality, but not so showy they'd be accused of overreaching. The working classes, caps, bonnets, or simpler straw hats. Practicality trumped peacocking when every shilling counted. And the divide was obvious. An Edwardian lady might stroll through Hyde Park and instantly know, without asking, who belonged to her social sphere. Wide brim, towering feathers, fine fabrics, aristocracy, or ambitious nouveau riche, plain felt, minimal decoration, someone earning a wage, not collecting rent from tenants. Hats spoke louder than words, and woe betide anyone who misjudged their costume. But hats went beyond wealth. They were moral signifiers. Respectability was everything in Edwardian society, and a well-kept fashionable hat was as crucial as clean fingernails or polished shoes. A shabby hat was practically a character assassination. People assumed you were slovenly, irresponsible, and probably on the fast track to moral ruin. Conversely, a crisp, proper hat suggested discipline, cleanliness, and a good reputation. Qualities Edwardian society adored almost as much as feathers. Church attendance, for example, was practically a hat parade. Women arrived in their best headwear, not only to honor God, but to prove to the congregation that they were respectable, upright citizens. A poorly chosen hat on Sunday could ignite gossip faster than a scandalous novel. Neighbors didn't need to ask about your housekeeping. They'd already judged it by your brim. And then there was the question of marriage. Hats, like rings today, hinted at your availability. Married women generally wore more conservative, elegant hats. Fashionable, yes, but not too flamboyant. To overdo it was to risk accusations of vanity or worse, impropriety. Young, unmarried women, on the other hand, had more freedom to experiment. Their hats were often lighter, perkier, trimmed with flowers or ribbons that suggested youth and charm. A debutante's hat was like a peacock's tail. Its entire purpose was to attract attention. Widows, however, occupied a different hat category altogether. Mourning fashion was its own strict code, and hats followed suit. Black veils, simple fabrics, and minimal decoration conveyed grief and dignity. Wearing bright feathers too soon after your husband's death wasn't just tacky, it was scandalous. One misstep, and you weren't just judged as unfashionable, you were judged as heartless. Edwardians were experts at decoding these signals. They could glance at a woman's hat and deduce not just her wealth and marital status, but also her character. A brim too wide for your social rank, social climbing. A hat too plain for your income bracket, stinginess or eccentricity. Too many ribbons, frivolous. Too few, dreary. Every choice was a balancing act, and the rules were merciless. Hats were less about what you liked and more about what society demanded you should wear. Men, of course, were expected to understand these codes too. A gentleman courting a lady could read her hat like a map. Was she fashionable but modest? A good wife candidate? Or was she flamboyant and daring, thrilling but dangerous? Etiquette guides even instructed men on how to interpret hat styles at social events, as though they were decoding a secret code in a spy novel. The consequences of getting it wrong could be brutal. Imagine a middle-class woman daring to wear a hat too lavish for her means. Instead of admiration, she risked whispers of trying too hard. Likewise, a wealthy woman in a plain hat might be accused of eccentricity or of rejecting society's rules. Hats were high-stakes fashion. Mistakes weren't just embarrassing, they could damage reputations. Satirists loved poking fun at this. Cartoons showed women balancing absurd creations, with captions joking that their hats revealed everything from their bank balance to their husband's profession. One wit remarked that in Edwardian London you can read a woman's hat more quickly than her diary. It wasn't entirely a joke. Hats really were the first thing people judged, often before a single word was exchanged. Seen this way, Edwardian hats were less clothing and more conversation. They allowed women to navigate a society where direct speech about money, class, or marital prospects was often taboo. Instead of saying "I'm wealthy," you wore a brim so wide it could shade a carriage. Instead of declaring "I'm available," you wore flowers and ribbons that practically shouted springtime romance. Hats were a silent vocabulary, a set of visual cues everyone was trained to recognize. It's easy to laugh at the rigidity of these codes today, but we have our own versions. Designer handbags, branded sneakers, flashy watches. The Edwardians simply funneled their obsession into feathers, brims, and bows. And while today's status symbols might fit in your pocket, Edwardian status symbols could block out the sun. So yes, in the Edwardian world, hats were novels written in fabric and feather, read and critiqued by everyone who saw them. Your wealth, your respectability, your very moral fiber, all of it was perched on your head waiting to be judged. And if you thought you could avoid scrutiny by going hatless, forget it. In Edwardian society, no hat was the loudest signal of all, and it said quite plainly that you didn't belong. The Edwardians believed there was a hat for everything, and by everything I mean everything. Breakfast with friends? There was a hat for that. Garden party? Definitely a hat for that. Church service? Mandatory hat. Funeral? Hat, but in black. The only thing you didn't wear a hat to was bed, and even then nightcaps technically count. You weren't fully dressed unless your head looked like a floral arrangement gone rogue. The Edwardian upper and middle classes lived by a rigid social calendar, and hats were essential for navigating it. Each occasion demanded a different style, and not following the rules was as bad as showing up to a modern wedding in sweatpants. Hats weren't optional accessories, they were uniforms for the battlefield of social life. Take the garden party. These daytime events were the Instagram feeds of the Edwardian world, public displays of taste and prosperity. For women, hats meant flowers, pastel ribbons, and bright feathers designed to complement springtime dresses. Hats were cheerful, light, and playful, but still large enough to announce wealth. If your brim wasn't brushing someone else's cucumber sandwich, were you even really at a garden party? Then there were church services. These weren't just religious observances, they were fashion shows with sermons attached. Women wore elegant, respectable hats, nothing too garish, nothing too bare. The line was fine, you wanted to look your best for God, but you didn't want to look like you were trying to upstage him. A good church hat struck a balance between reverence and refinement. A flamboyant feather arrangement at Sunday Mass? Scandalous. A plain cap? Almost worse, it suggested a lack of effort. Funerals had their own rules. Mourning attire was governed by a strict etiquette, and hats were central to it. Black was mandatory, veils were common, and decorations were minimal. A well-chosen mourning hat said, "I am solemn, dignified, and utterly devastated." Wearing anything brighter than grey was social suicide. If you accidentally turned up in a hat with coloured trim, you weren't just unfashionable, you were practically accused of dancing on the grave. On the opposite end of the spectrum were weddings. Here, hats were opportunities to shine, but carefully. Guests wore colourful, decorated hats, often with flowers or lace, while brides and their mothers wore elegant, elaborate pieces that set them apart. This was an arena where milliners competed for glory, crafting hats that flirted with extravagance without overshadowing the bride. Edwardian etiquette dictated that no guest should outshine the central figures, but let's be honest, many tried. Imagine balancing half an ostrich plume while pretending to look modest. Horse races like Ascot were perhaps the pinnacle of occasion-specific hats. These events were excuses for aristocrats and social climbers alike to show off their most outrageous headwear. Ascot, in particular, was notorious for hats so wide and feathered they might have doubled as parade floats. For many women, the horses were background noise. The real race was between milliners. Winning meant being photographed, sketched, or talked about in society columns. Losing meant you'd chosen something tragically understated, doomed to vanish in the feathery crowd. Everyday hats mattered too. Women didn't simply step outside hatless, even shopping required one. A small straw hat for errands, perhaps, or a simple felt for walking. This constant need for occasion-appropriate hats turned closets into veritable stables of headwear. A respectable woman might own half a dozen or more, carefully rotated depending on time of day and social duty. Men joked that marrying a fashionable wife meant half your budget went to her milliner. They weren't entirely wrong. Edwardians even divided hats by time of day. Morning hats were simple and fresh, smaller brims, lighter fabrics. Afternoon hats grew larger, decorated with flowers or feathers, suitable for strolls in the park or visits with friends. Evening hats were smaller again, often adorned with veils or jewels to suit candle-lit dinners and balls. A woman who wore her evening hat in the morning might as well have walked out naked. People would whisper, stare, and quietly edge away, convinced she'd lost her grip on propriety. The real purpose of these rules wasn't practicality, it was social surveillance. Hats told others instantly whether you understood the codes of behavior. A woman who wore the wrong hat at the wrong occasion wasn't just committing a fashion faux pas, she was outing herself as socially ignorant. For the upwardly mobile middle class, getting the hat calendar right was essential. One misstep, and whispers could follow you for weeks. A young woman's future could be dimmed by nothing more than the wrong feather at the wrong time. Of course, the absurdity of all this didn't go unnoticed. Satirical sketches poked fun at women struggling to balance their hats while trying to sit in pews, or competing for attention at weddings while the bride stood ignored in the background. One cartoon showed a funeral where the hats were so enormous that the coffin couldn't be carried out of the church. Edwardians knew they were ridiculous, but they also knew that ridicule was part of the fun. Fashion, after all, thrived on drama, and yet there was power in this ritual. For Edwardian women, whose social mobility was often limited, hats offered a way to navigate society with precision. By choosing the right hat for the right moment, you could declare your taste, respectability, and awareness of social codes without saying a word. Hats were silent passports, giving you entry to circles where conversation alone might fail. So yes, in the Edwardian era, there truly was a hat for every occasion. From solemn funerals to lively horse races, from Sunday worship to afternoon tea, the right brim, feather, or veil was as essential as the dress beneath it. Each event was another page in the endless Edwardian etiquette manual, and your hat was the headline. Get it right, and you were admired. Get it wrong, and you were unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. In the end, Edwardian hats weren't just accessories, they were scripts. Every occasion wrote its own scene, and your head was the stage. The question wasn't whether you wore a hat, the question was whether your hat told the right story at the right time. While Edwardian women were busy turning their heads into floating gardens of feathers, fruit, and flowers, Edwardian men approached hats with the kind of caution usually reserved for military uniforms. Their styles were restrained, uniform, and let's be honest, sometimes downright dull compared to the carnival happening on women's heads. Men's hats were so boring they basically invented hair gel to compensate. Yet within their restraint, these hats told their own coded stories about class, occasion, and character. The most iconic of all was the bowler hat. Rounded crown, narrow brim, stiff felt construction. It was the workhorse of men's fashion. Born in the mid-19th century, by the Edwardian era, it was firmly entrenched as the middle-class man's uniform. Bank clerks, shopkeepers, lawyers and city businessmen could be spotted en masse in their bowlers as they scuttled through London's fog. It was practical, affordable and durable. Unlike women's creations that collapsed at the first drop of rain, the bowler could withstand weather, crowded trains, and the occasional bar fight. If Edwardian hats were ranked by survival rate, the bowler would win every time. The bowler also carried connotations of respectability. Wearing one meant you were serious, reliable, and unlikely to faint in front of your boss. Too humble for the aristocracy, and too plain for the flashy set, it was the hat of the ambitious professional, a silent proclamation of steady income and cautious ambition. The bowler never tried to outshine, it simply announced that you belonged to the sensible backbone of Edwardian society. At the other extreme stood the top hat, the crowning symbol of wealth and authority. This wasn't just a hat, it was a skyscraper balanced on your scalp, tall, sleek, and made of silk or beaver felt polished to a shine. The top hat was an architectural wonder of restraint. Unlike women's creations which overflowed with decoration, the top hat's power came from its stark simplicity. Its height and gleam declared superiority without a single feather needed. Aristocrats, politicians and financiers wore them like crowns, towering above the crowd. Wearing a top hat, however, came with practical drawbacks. Try running in one, try leaning back in a carriage without bumping the ceiling. Even tilting your head to greet someone risked dislodging the entire edifice, but impracticality was part of its allure. A man in a top hat didn't need to move quickly or comfortably, he had underlings for that. The very stiffness of the style was a metaphor for the aristocratic stiffness of the man beneath it. And while women balanced wide-brimmed hats that blocked sightlines, men balanced tall ones that blocked skylines. It was inconvenience as status. Then there was the boater, the summer darling of men's fashion. Flat crown, stiff straw, and a ribbon trim, it was the hat of leisure. Boaters were worn at regattas, picnics and seaside holidays, conjuring images of punting along the Thames or singing in barbershop quartets. To wear a boater was to declare, "I have enough money to spend an afternoon doing nothing." It was cheerful, light and just frivolous enough to suggest you weren't chained to a desk. But heaven forbid you wore one out of season. Boaters were strictly for spring and summer and only in the right settings. Show up in November wearing one and people would look at you as though you'd forgotten your trousers. Together, these three hats formed a male uniform as rigid as women's feathered extravagance, but far less flamboyant. Where women's hats screamed individuality, men's whispered conformity. They signaled class, but only in shades of restraint. The solid professional in his bowler, the aristocrat in his top hat, the leisure gentleman in his boater. Edwardian men had far less room to maneuver with their choices. You couldn't exactly walk into a business meeting in a straw boater, nor attend a seaside picnic in a black silk topper without being ridiculed. The wrong hat didn't just make you look odd, it could undermine your entire role in society. The contrast with women's hats is almost comedic. While women were craning under the weight of plumes and blossoms, men looked nearly identical in their rows of bowlers like penguins waddling in formation. Their uniformity was so complete that it inspired satire. Cartoonists loved to draw crowds of indistinguishable men, with only the slightest hint of personality poking out beneath identical crowns. Hats for men weren't about flair, they were about blending into the correct group at the correct time. Still, subtle differences mattered. The shine of your top hat, the crispness of your boater's ribbon, or the cleanliness of your bowler, all reflected on your personal discipline. A scuffed hat meant sloppiness, just as surely as a sagging brim ruined a woman's reputation. Men may not have worn birds on their heads, but they were judged by the care of their more subdued styles. After all, nothing said unreliable employee quite like a bowler with rain stains. In many ways, men's hats reinforced Edwardian ideals of masculinity. Serious, stiff and uniform, they mirrored the expectations placed on men themselves. Women could express, embellish and exaggerate, but men were expected to project stability and authority. The bowler, the top hat, the boater, they weren't just styles, they were symbols of who men were supposed to be. Reliable workers, commanding leaders, or leisured gentlemen. Step outside those boundaries, and you risked being laughed at or worse, suspected of eccentricity. So while Edwardian men's hats may look dull next to women's towering creations, they reveal just as much about the period's obsession with identity and propriety. Hats kept men in their lanes, ensuring that professionals looked professional, aristocrats looked aristocratic, and holidaymakers looked holiday-ready. Fashion for men wasn't a playground, it was a tightrope, and perhaps that's why men clung to their hair pomades, moustache waxes, and carefully polished shoes. If their hats were going to be boring, something else had to pick up the slack. If you thought Edwardian fashion spared the children, think again. In this era, hats were not only a necessity for adults, but a non-negotiable for little ones too. The moment a child's head peeked above the cradle, society seemed to cry out, "Quick, cover it with something decorative." Hats for children weren't merely about sun protection or warmth. They were about what those tiny heads said about the entire family. Your toddler wasn't just cute, they were a walking advertisement for family pride. For little boys, the most iconic option was the sailor cap. Inspired by the naval uniforms of Britain's global empire, sailor suits and caps became staples for boys of the middle and upper classes. A boy in a crisp sailor cap wasn't just dressed, he was practically a poster child for patriotism and discipline. Parents adored the association. Dressing a child like a miniature seaman suggested loyalty, strength, and preparedness for the responsibilities of manhood. Of course, the boys themselves may have cared less about imperial pride and more about whether the cap stayed on during tree-climbing adventures, but fashion rarely asked for their opinion. The sailor cap also carried subtle class messages. For wealthy families, commissioning finely tailored sailor suits and perfectly fitted caps from London shops was an act of pride. Middle-class families, eager to copy aristocratic trends, bought cheaper imitations. Either way, the cap sent a message before the child said a word. My family is respectable, patriotic, and possibly a little obsessed with the Navy. For poorer families, plainer caps or simple cloth head coverings sufficed. But in Edwardian parks and seaside promenades, sailor caps were as common as scraped knees. Little girls, on the other hand, were treated like miniaturized ladies in training. Their hats were scaled-down versions of the extravagants perched on their mothers' heads. Picture a tiny bonnet or straw hat, carefully trimmed with ribbons, silk flowers, or even modest feathers, all balanced precariously on a head not much larger than a dinner plate. The sight was adorable, yes, but also deeply symbolic. These hats announced the family's taste, wealth, and perhaps most importantly, their commitment to raising daughters who understood fashion etiquette from the cradle. If mother's hat shouted grandeur, daughter's hat echoed it, albeit in squeakier tones. And it wasn't all sweetness. The expectations placed on children's hats could be strict. A crooked ribbon, proof that a mother was inattentive. A boy without a cap in public, a father seen as careless. Hats were less about the child's comfort and more about parental reputation. In photographs of the period, children are almost always pictured with something strapped to their heads, sometimes oversized, sometimes clearly uncomfortable. Smiles weren't required, but hats were mandatory. Occasions dictated children's hats just as much as adults. Sunday meant tidy, polished headwear suitable for church, often in subdued colors. Garden parties brought lighter, frillier confections for girls, straw boaters for boys, each one matching the seasonal flowers or pastel tones of their parents. Holidays at the seaside, boys in jaunty caps, girls in wide straw hats meant to protect their pale Edwardian skin from the sun. Even playtime in the park often required a hat, albeit one parents could scold about less if it inevitably ended up muddy. Some hats crossed the line from charming to downright comical. Fashion magazines showed girls in hats nearly half the size of their torsos, bows and feathers bouncing awkwardly as they toddled about. Boys, meanwhile, sometimes endured stiff miniature versions of adult bowlers or top hats, which made them look like pocket-sized bankers. The effect was less cute child and more apprentice insurance clerk. Still, parents adored the symbolism. Their children were rehearsing adulthood, one brim at a time. These miniature hats also reinforced gender expectations early. Boys in their sailor caps were encouraged to embody discipline, physical energy, and a connection to Britain's empire. Girls in their decorated bonnets were praised for neatness, beauty, and a sense of delicate propriety. A boy's hat prepared him to lead, a girl's prepared her to attract. Even the ribbons and trims had lessons baked in. Not too much, lest it look garish. Not too little, lest it look careless. A child's hat was less a piece of clothing than a rehearsal script for their adult role in society. And like their parents, children were judged by these hats in public. Nannies pushing prams through Hyde Park knew their employers' reputations rested on the children's presentation. A well-turned-out toddler in a clean, well-trimmed bonnet reflected on the family's social status. A bare-headed child, hair blowing wild in the breeze, risked whispers. Perhaps the family couldn't afford proper clothing, or worse, didn't care about propriety. Hats, in short, were armor for reputation, even when perched on the heads of people too young to spell the word hat. Of course, practicality was often sacrificed in the name of appearances. Children tugged, scratched, and cried under itchy ribbons and heavy trims. Hats blew off in gusts of wind, fell into puddles, or were deliberately hurled away during tantrums. Nannies and parents chased after them with grim determination, because losing a hat in public wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a small social crisis. For the child, liberation from the hat meant momentary freedom. For the parents, it meant embarrassment. Looking back, Edwardian children's hats are both charming and a little absurd. They remind us that even the youngest members of society weren't spared from the pressures of fashion codes. Their heads became miniature billboards of parental pride, symbols of class aspiration, and tiny rehearsals for the roles they were expected to play as adults. The hats might have been small, but the statements they made were enormous. When Edwardians talked about horse races, they weren't just talking about horses. Yes, there were thoroughbreds galloping down tracks at breakneck speed, jockeys clinging for dear life, and wagers flying left and right. But let's be honest, the real race wasn't happening on the turf, it was happening above people's foreheads. The horses ran the race, but the real competition was happening on people's heads. Events like Ascot, Goodwood, and Epsom were less about the sporting spectacle and more about who wore what. For the Edwardian elite, attending a horse show wasn't about admiring the animals, it was about parading in front of society and, most importantly, being seen. And nothing declared presence quite like a hat. These events transformed into outdoor catwalks, where hats strutted just as proudly as the horses in the paddocks. Ascot, in particular, became the holy ground of hat watching. Originally established in the 18th century as a horse racing venue, by the Edwardian period it had transformed into a fashion showcase. Women arrived in carriages dressed in the most extravagant outfits imaginable, but it was the headwear that took center stage. A simple straw boater wasn't going to cut it. At Ascot, your hat needed to be enormous, flamboyant, and ideally so distracting that people forgot there were actual races happening. Society columns often reported more about the millinery than the winners on the track. If your horse lost but your hat won the headlines, you had still triumphed. The variety was staggering. Some hats featured cascades of ostrich plumes that trailed down the back like waterfalls. Others bristled with artificial flowers, velvet ribbons, or entire clusters of fruit, because nothing says elegance like grapes glued to your scalp. The bravest ladies balanced towering concoctions that seemed one wobble away from collapse, daring gravity to do its worst. Each hat was a gamble of its own. Would it stay upright? Or would it topple into a neighbour's champagne glass mid-cheer? Of course, these hat parades weren't just fashion statements, they were social power moves. Ascot was the kind of place where reputations were built or shattered in a single afternoon. A woman's hat wasn't just judged for its beauty, but for its appropriateness, boldness, and originality. Too simple, and you'd vanish in the crowd. Too outrageous, and you'd be mocked as vulgar. The sweet spot was where admiration lingered just long enough to earn a mention in the gossip pages. In this high-stakes game, milliners were the secret generals, strategizing months in advance to craft showstoppers for their clients. And it wasn't only women under scrutiny. Men, though limited to their uniformed bowlers and top hats, were expected to ensure their hats gleamed with polish, crowns unblemished, ribbons crisp. At events like Ascot, the difference between a respectable gentleman and a careless one might be nothing more than the shine of his topper. While women competed in plumage and drama, men competed in immaculate restraint. The contrast was comical. Beside a woman whose brim rivaled the size of a parasol, her husband might stand stiffly, top hat gleaming, looking less like a peacock and more like a lamppost. But horse shows weren't just for the aristocracy. Middle-class families came too, eager to rub elbows with the elite, or at least to watch them from a respectful distance. For them, hats were a ticket into aspirational society. Women saved up for months to buy a hat worthy of Ascot, even if it meant sacrificing other luxuries. The investment was enormous, but the payoff was priceless. A chance to be seen, admired, and maybe mistaken for someone grander. It was social camouflage stitched together with velvet and feathers. Naturally, the absurdity of it all attracted satire. Newspapers gleefully printed sketches of hats so wide they needed their own seating arrangements, or so tall they blocked spectators from seeing the race. One cartoon showed a jockey desperately swerving to avoid a feather plume dangling onto the track. Humor aside, the hat spectacle was deadly serious for the Edwardians. A poorly chosen creation might consign you to the sidelines of society. A winning hat might open doors to new friendships, courtships, or business alliances. What made these events so powerful was the mingling of fashion with public performance. Unlike private dinner parties or drawing rooms, horse shows were open-air arenas where thousands of eyes roved and judged. Every carriage arrival was a moment of suspense. What feathered creation would emerge next? Every promenade along the grandstands was an opportunity to strut one's hat like plumage in a mating dance. The horses might have worn saddles, but the women wore entire ecosystems. Behind all this pageantry was an army of milliners who timed their year around these events. Ascot season was their Super Bowl. Shops across London advertised Ascot hats weeks in advance, offering women the chance to claim originality before anyone else snapped up a similar design. Milliners whispered that a truly successful hat wasn't one that blended in, but one that caused strangers to crane their necks for another look. In this sense, hats were not simply accessories, they were tactical weapons in the war of visibility. Looking back, horse shows of the Edwardian period were as much fashion weeks as sporting events. Yes, fortunes were won and lost on the racetrack, but reputations were built in the grandstand. The horses galloped, but the women glided, their hats bobbing like ships with sails unfurled, commanding attention. For many Edwardians, the real prize at Ascot wasn't a trophy or a winning bet. It was a line in the next day's newspaper declaring their hat the talk of the town. So when we imagine Edwardian race days, let's not picture the horses first. Let's picture the crowds in their finery, feathers quivering in the breeze, brims colliding in narrow aisles, and fashion battles waged in full public view. For Edwardian society, the race was important, but the hat race was everything. In Edwardian England, hats didn't just drift into fashion out of nowhere, they were anointed from above. When it came to style, all roads led to the palace or at least to the drawing rooms of society's most powerful women. If Queen Alexandra wore it, suddenly everyone wanted to look like a royal lamppost. The crown jewels might have sat in the Tower of London, but the true crown for Edwardian society was the hat perched on the Queen's head. Queen Alexandra, wife of King Edward VII, was the ultimate trendsetter. Her influence extended beyond dresses and jewels. Her hats were studied, copied, and fawned over with the intensity of stock market charts. Milliners prayed she would appear in public with one of their creations because that single moment could set off a frenzy of imitations across Britain and beyond. Alexandra had the uncanny ability to make a style look both regal and achievable. turning what might have seemed excessive on anyone else into the pinnacle of grace. If she wore towering plumes, so did half of London the next week. If she opted for a velvet-trimmed bonnet, sales of velvet skyrocketed. She was, in essence, the Edwardian Instagram influencer, only with carriages instead of selfies. Her taste leaned toward hats that emphasized height and elegance, often paired with veils that softened her face. Society ladies adored this look, not just because it was fashionable, but because it had a strategic advantage. Queen Alexandra was known for concealing a scar on her neck with high collars and veils. Hats with veiling mirrored her style while also offering women a tool to hide their own perceived flaws. Alexandra wasn't simply dictating fashion. She was handing society subtle ways to feel dignified and secure, all under the guise of millinery. But Alexandra wasn't alone in steering the Edwardian hat craze. The era was brimming with social leaders whose choices dictated what was in or out. Aristocratic hostesses like Consuelo Vanderbilt, the Duchess of Marlborough, or Lady Curzon in India, became unofficial ambassadors of fashion. Their hats, photographed or described in lavish detail in magazines, became templates for women desperate to keep up with high society. If Lady Curzon arrived at a ball wearing a crown of ostrich feathers arranged like a fan, you could bet that the following season would see imitations flooding the millinery counters at Harrods. Even beyond Britain, international figures weighed in. Parisian socialites and actresses influenced styles that filtered into English society, while American heiresses married into the British aristocracy during this dollar princess era brought their own twists. It was a global game of sartorial telephone. A French countess wore something bold at the opera. It got sketched in a fashion magazine. An American debutante copied it for a New York gala, and within months it appeared on the heads of London's ambitious middle class. Fashion wasn't local anymore. It was international gossip in feather form. The theatre also played a key role in pushing trends. Stage stars like Lily Elsie and Gabrielle Ray often appeared in productions with extravagant hats that audiences rushed to imitate. A popular operetta could spark as many fashion imitations as a royal wedding. Actresses became fashion authorities, their every costume copied by women eager to capture a slice of theatrical glamour in everyday life. Milliners paid close attention to the stage, knowing that a single role could make or break an entire season's inventory. But while the royals and elites set the direction, the wider public scrambled to follow, often at great expense. Middle-class women stretched budgets to imitate Alexandra's veils or the Duchess's plumes, even if they had to settle for cheaper fabrics or dyed chicken feathers instead of imported ostrich. The working class, too, absorbed these trends through penny magazines filled with sketches of what society wore. They might not afford the real thing, but even modest imitations allowed them to nod toward the trends decreed by their betters. In this way, hats became not just fashion but aspiration, tangible symbols of the desire to climb socially one feather at a time. It's worth remembering that not all influence was benign. Royalty and social leaders drove demand for rare and exotic materials, spurring destructive global feather trades and endless overwork for milliners. The Queen might wear a shimmering new plume with serene indifference, but behind it lay weeks of labor and often the extinction of some unlucky bird. This was the hidden underside of royal influence. What looked like effortless grace was in fact a carefully curated and environmentally costly performance. Still, the cultural pull of these leaders cannot be overstated. Their hats weren't just fashion. They were endorsements of how society should look, act, and even think. Women who copied Queen Alexandra's style weren't just imitating her beauty. They were affirming their place within a social order that valued refinement, restraint, and grandeur. Hats became the shorthand for loyalty to this system, and milliners knew that one nod from a royal could transform a style from eccentric to indispensable. In hindsight, it's easy to laugh at the feverish devotion to royal and aristocratic hat choices. But think about it. Are we really so different? Today, celebrities and royals can sell out an entire clothing line with one photo. Edwardians simply did it with feathers and velvet. Queen Alexandra didn't post her hat on social media. She wore it to a ball. The reaction was the same: immediate reputation, frantic chatter, and a fashion industry scrambling to keep up. So yes, if the Queen wore it, everyone wanted it. Royalty and social leaders weren't just style icons, they were millinery monarchs, ruling the hat world with every plume and veil. And for Edwardian women, copying them wasn't frivolity. It was survival in a society where hats were the front line of identity. If Edwardian hats were the crown of fashion, department stores were their glittering throne rooms. By the early 20th century, shopping for a hat wasn't just an errand, it was a performance, a spectacle, an all-day outing that mixed commerce with theatre. Places like Harrods in London or Galeries Lafayette in Paris weren't merely shops, they were temples to consumption, and at their heart sat the millinery counters. Millinery counters were basically Sephora for your forehead. Picture the scene: polished marble floors, gaslight chandeliers sparkling above, the smell of polished wood and perfume mingling in the air, elevators, a modern marvel at the time, whisked customers up to millinery departments where entire rooms were devoted to feathers, ribbons, and shimmering fabrics. Hat shopping was designed to overwhelm. Counters brimmed with blossoms of silk flowers, glass cases displayed delicate veils, and racks upon racks showcased hats perched like exotic birds waiting to be chosen. Shopping itself had changed. Before the rise of department stores, women bought hats directly from milliners in small, specialized shops. But the new consumer palaces of the Edwardian era offered something different: scale. Suddenly you could browse dozens, even hundreds of hats at once, each one carefully lit and displayed to seduce. It was less like running an errand and more like attending a fashion show where you were also expected to take something home. For many women, especially the middle classes, the millinery counter was intoxicating. Department stores blurred the boundaries between elite and everyday shoppers. A duchess might be trying on a hat in one corner, while a grocer's wife browsed more modest options in another. Everyone could participate, even if the outcome was different. For the ambitious middle-class woman, stepping into Harrods wasn't just about purchasing. It was about breathing in the air of high society, trying on status, if only for an afternoon. The process was an elaborate ritual. First, a lady would be ushered to a seat in front of a mirror. Attendants hovered nearby, their arms stacked with options, ready to crown her with one confection after another. Hats were tried on, tilted, adjusted, and discarded in rapid succession, each one provoking murmurs from companions or discreet headshakes from salesgirls. The right hat was a revelation, the wrong one, a miniature tragedy. This ritual extended beyond simply finding a good fit. Department stores trained their assistants to act as subtle guides in fashion etiquette. A salesgirl might hint that a certain brim was more appropriate for morning wear, or suggest that a veil of a particular shade was so very Ascot this year. Customers weren't just buying hats, they were buying access to insider knowledge, reassurance that their choices aligned with society's ever-shifting codes. A hat was a purchase, but also a passport to belonging. Of course, this system thrived on pressure. Department stores were experts in the art of seduction. Elaborate displays lured women to counters. Mirrors were angled to flatter, and assistants laid it on thick with flattery. "That feather frames your face beautifully," they would say, or "the Duchess herself has ordered one just like it." And who could resist? Even if your budget was screaming no, your vanity whispered yes. In many households, hat bills became a source of domestic tension, with husbands despairing at the endless parade of ribboned boxes arriving by carriage. But shopping for hats wasn't just about the individual, it was social. Women went together, often in groups, making an afternoon of it. They browsed, tried on, gossiped, and judged one another's choices. Hat counters became informal salons where alliances were forged, rivalries sharpened, and social hierarchies reinforced. Choosing a hat was rarely done alone. It was a group verdict, and the approval of your friends mattered almost as much as the approval of your mirror. For shop owners, the millinery department was pure gold. Hats were high-margin items, and the variety of trimmings meant endless opportunities for upselling. Would Madame prefer ostrich or egret plumes with her bonnet? Shall we add a veil? perhaps a matching ribbon. Each suggestion piled pounds onto the final bill, and because hats were tied to specific occasions and seasons, women needed not one but several: morning hats, afternoon hats, Ascot hats, church hats. The list never ended. Department stores thrived on this cycle of demand, keeping counters stocked with the latest Parisian imports to stoke the mania. Department store catalogues also extended the frenzy beyond city limits. Glossy illustrations allowed women in smaller towns to order the latest styles by post, bridging the gap between rural customers and urban fashion centres. Even if you lived hundreds of miles from London, a Harrods hat could still arrive at your doorstep, neatly boxed and ready to declare your participation in Edwardian modernity. It was mail-order aspiration at its finest. Looking back, it's easy to see these hat counters as the ancestors of our modern consumer culture. The combination of spectacle, accessibility, flattery, and constant novelty would feel familiar in any luxury store today. Women weren't just shopping, they were performing a role, experimenting with identity, and staging little dramas in front of gilded mirrors. The hat counters were theatres, and every customer became both actress and audience. So when we imagine Edwardian department stores, don't think of quiet halls filled with polite shoppers. Think of bustling rooms alive with chatter, laughter, and indecision. Think of piles of feathers cascading across tables, mirrors reflecting rows of hopeful faces, and assistants fluttering like stagehands in a play of endless costume changes. Think of millinery counters where fortunes were spent, reputations secured, and a woman's forehead left adorned with the latest triumph of fashion. Of all the tools in the Edwardian fashion arsenal, none balanced elegance and menace quite like the hatpin. At first glance, these were delicate objects, slender rods of metal tipped with pearls, beads, or tiny gemstones, designed to hold elaborate hats in place. But don't let their dainty appearance fool you. Hatpins weren't just accessories, they were weapons of opportunity. Your accessory could double as a murder weapon, style and safety in one. Here's the problem. Edwardian hats weren't exactly lightweight. Brims stretched wide enough to cover small villages, while plumes, ribbons, and artificial blossoms piled on top like a garden gone rogue. Without a secure anchor, one gust of wind or a sharp turn of the head, and your entire hat risked sailing down the street like a runaway kite. Enter the hatpin, a long, sharp needle, sometimes 12 inches or more, that pierced through hat, hair, and bun to pin everything together. For milliners and their customers, hatpins were indispensable. They turned gravity-defying millinery creations into wearable architecture. A woman could stride confidently through a breezy park, knowing her ostrich plumes wouldn't launch into the nearest pond. Hatpins also allowed hats to perch at fashionable angles, jaunty tilts, or dramatic slants without wobbling out of place. In short, they were engineering marvels disguised as jewelry, but their practicality was matched by their danger. A foot-long piece of sharpened steel tucked into a woman's hat was essentially a concealed weapon, and Edwardians noticed. Newspaper stories occasionally reported accidents: hats knocked askew in a crowded tram, hatpins jutting out like swords, neighbors stabbed in the cheek or the shoulder. It was joked that sitting too close to a fashionable lady was more dangerous than riding in a cavalry charge. Soon enough, women realized the potential for deliberate use. At a time when female respectability was policed and personal safety was precarious, the hatpin became a subtle tool of self-defense. If a man in a crowded streetcar leaned a little too close, one quick jab from a hatpin sent a message more effective than words. Women walking alone at night could feel a sense of security knowing they carried, quite literally, a weapon tucked into their hairstyle. One suffragette even called the hatpin her silent guardian. This dual function caused quite a stir in Edwardian society. City officials and police began to worry about the proliferation of hatpins in public spaces. By the early 1910s, regulations cropped up in cities like London and Chicago, mandating protective tips on pins or limiting their length. The logic was simple: no one wanted public transit to double as a fencing match. Newspapers debated the morality of these restrictions. Were they protecting citizens from accidental stabbings, or unfairly limiting women's independence. And of course, men couldn't resist satirizing it. Cartoons appeared showing women armed with hatpins like bayonets, fending off swarms of hapless suitors. Some moralists even suggested the hatpin represented a breakdown of feminine gentleness. Others, however, admired it as a symbol of female empowerment, a weapon hidden in plain sight. Either way, the hatpin wasn't just steel and ornament, it was a cultural flashpoint. The designs themselves were miniature works of art. The simplest were plain metal rods, functional and cheap, sold by the dozen, but luxury versions sparkled with enamel, carved ivory, or even diamonds. A fashionable lady might own a whole collection, swapping tips to match her outfit. Display cases in department stores glittered with rows of hatpins, tempting customers with their mix of utility and glamour. In an era when jewelry was often confined to the elite, hatpins offered even middle-class women the thrill of owning something decorative and precious. Of course, not everyone approved. Critics complained that hatpins, especially when decorated lavishly, encouraged vanity and extravagance. For working-class women, the rising demand for affordable hatpins meant another expense added to the already overwhelming list of fashion necessities. And yet the accessory was unavoidable. Hats required pins. No pins, no hat. It wasn't indulgence, it was survival in the world of Edwardian etiquette. The legal debates added a layer of comedy. In Chicago, women were arrested for wearing illegal hatpins with unprotected ends. In London, newspapers carried stories of magistrates scolding ladies for endangering the public with their accessories. Imagine being dragged before a judge because your hatpin was 2 inches too long. Fashion became a matter of law, and women bristled at being told to blunt the very tools that kept them both stylish and safe. Despite all the fuss, hatpins endured. Their popularity peaked in the Edwardian era, but their symbolism lasted far longer. They represented more than practicality or ornament. They were the rare accessory that gave women both beauty and agency. In a society where women's choices were constrained, the hatpin was a sly rebellion, part of a rigid dress code, yet sharp enough to draw blood if necessary. Looking back, it's tempting to chuckle at the melodrama of it all. Newspapers fretting about armies of pin-wielding women, magistrates wringing their hands over sharp accessories, men making jokes about being skewered on dates. But beneath the humor was a serious truth. The hatpin was one of the few tools Edwardian women carried that gave them real control, whether over their hats, their image, or their safety. So next time you see one of those glittering pins in a museum case, don't just think pretty, think practical dagger disguised as jewelry. Think of Edwardian women boarding crowded trams, heads held high, hats firmly in place, ready to parry both the wind and unwanted advances. Because in the Edwardian world, fashion wasn't just about looking good, it was about surviving, one sharp accessory at a time. If Edwardian hats were a language, etiquette was the grammar that held it all together. Hats weren't just plopped on your head and forgotten. They were governed by a complex code of rules, so intricate it could make a lawyer sweat. The Edwardians loved nothing more than turning daily life into a performance of manners, and hats provided endless opportunities for both elegance and disaster. Take your hat off at the wrong time, and you might as well announce you're a barbarian. For men, the rules were particularly strict, and everyone noticed if you slipped up. A gentleman's hat was to be removed indoors, especially in private homes, restaurants, or churches. Keeping your bowler or top hat on during dinner was the social equivalent of burping loudly at the table. Public buildings had their nuances. In railway stations or hotel lobbies, you might keep your hat on while passing through, but once you stopped to converse, it was expected to come off. And woe betide the man who forgot to lift his hat in greeting. That little tip or lift of the brim wasn't optional. It was a ritual gesture of respect. Neglecting it risked branding you as rude or worse, unrefined. Women, however, played by an entirely different set of rules. Unlike men, they were expected to keep their hats on indoors. In fact, wearing a hat was part of their complete dress, and removing it in public was seen as undressing. A lady arriving at church, a party, or even a theatre kept her hat firmly in place, even if it meant blocking the view of a dozen unlucky people behind her. Only in the privacy of one's home, or in the presence of very close family, could the hat come off. The hat wasn't just fashion, it was armor, a marker of propriety. To remove it was to lower that shield and risk exposing oneself in ways society didn't tolerate. But the rules didn't stop at on or off. There were subtleties that bordered on the absurd. Time of day dictated hat choices, small, neat hats in the morning, increasingly elaborate designs for afternoon strolls, and lighter, elegant pieces for evening events. Wearing the wrong type at the wrong hour was an invitation for gossip. Arrive at an afternoon tea in a plain morning hat. You'd be whispered about before the teacups were poured. Show up to a dinner in a hat too extravagant? People would assume you didn't know your place in society. Etiquette was as much about when as it was about what. Social occasions had their own quirks. In churches, women's hats were expected to strike a balance between respectability and style. Too flamboyant, and you risked accusations of vanity in a holy space. Too plain, and you appeared careless about honoring the occasion. Funerals, of course, demanded subdued hats in black or muted tones, often with veils. Wearing anything cheerful was a social death sentence. Weddings flipped the script. Here, hats had to be festive and elegant, but never so dramatic that they outshone the brides. Choosing incorrectly wasn't just embarrassing, it was disrespectful. The Edwardian world was nothing if not ruthless in its judgments. Even the act of handling your hat had rules. A gentleman removing his hat was expected to hold it gracefully, never dangle it carelessly by the brim. The interior lining was not to be flashed around like the inside of a wallet. A lady, if she needed to adjust her hatpin or ribbon, was to do so discreetly. Fiddling openly with your headwear in public was considered vulgar, as though you were reminding everyone that your glorious creation was merely pinned and stitched together, rather than a natural extension of your elegance. And let's not forget the hat as a tool of greeting. A man encountering a lady on the street would lift or tip his hat. Failing to do so was an insult. For women, acknowledgement came in the form of a nod, her hat acting as a crown that required no removal. This asymmetry wasn't just etiquette, it was symbolic of gender roles. Men showed deference through removal, women displayed status through retention. The hat was, in a way, a stage prop for the performance of Edwardian gender expectations. Of course, all of this created endless opportunities for humiliation. Imagine being a nervous young man at your first society dinner, hat in hand, fumbling to remember whether to remove it at the door or after being seated. Get it wrong and you'd feel every eye on you, silently condemning your manners. Women, too, lived under the constant threat of scrutiny. A hat too large at the wrong function marked you as vulgar. One too modest at a gala suggested you didn't understand your role. These weren't minor errors, they were social crimes punishable by gossip, exclusion, and ruined reputations. Satirists naturally had a field day with the absurdity. Cartoons mocked men tripping over themselves to remove hats at the slightest sign of a lady, or women stubbornly blocking entire theatre rows with their never-removed masterpieces. One humorist quipped that Edwardian etiquette required 3 hands, 2 for gloves and 1 for hats. The comedy stemmed from a truth. Managing one's hat in society was as demanding as managing polite conversation, and often far riskier. At its heart, hat etiquette reinforced the Edwardian obsession with appearances. It wasn't enough to own the right hat. You had to wear it correctly, handle it gracefully, and time its use with surgical precision. Hats were less accessories and more test papers in the never-ending examination of social standing. One false move, and you failed the class. Looking back, the sheer complexity feels exhausting, but it also reveals how much weight hats carried in Edwardian life. They weren't just head coverings, they were symbols of discipline, propriety, and social intelligence. The brim wasn't just fabric, it was a line drawn between respectability and ridicule. The Edwardian suffragette movement wasn't just about speeches, marches, and banners, it was also about hats. In a society where headwear was practically a second face, suffragettes knew that the hat could be an ally or a saboteur. It wasn't enough to storm Parliament or chain yourself to railings. You had to look respectable while doing it. Nothing says revolution like shouting for votes while balancing a birdcage on your head. For suffragettes, fashion was a political battlefield. They were keenly aware that critics painted them as unfeminine troublemakers, hysterical, and outside the bounds of polite society. To counter this, they turned to clothing, and especially hats, as weapons of image. A suffragette in a well-trimmed hat sent a powerful message. She wasn't rejecting femininity or decorum. She was redefining them. She could wear a stylish hat and still demand the vote. In fact, the hat became a clever disguise, cloaking radical activism in the armor of respectability. Suffragette gatherings often looked like elegant garden parties at first glance. Rows of women in proper dresses and hats marched down city streets, their headwear fluttering with ribbons, flowers, or plumes. To passers-by, this spectacle was disarming. It wasn't a mob of unruly agitators. It was society ladies and working women alike, dressed in their best, carrying banners alongside their millinery masterpieces. Hats softened the visual blow, lulling skeptics before the chants began. The hats themselves often bore subtle hints of political allegiance. Many suffragettes embraced the movement's colors: green, hope; white, purity; and purple, dignity. Ribbons, feathers, or fabric trims in these shades adorned their hats, creating a hidden code that other supporters instantly recognized. At a distance it looked like fashion. Up close it was politics stitched into silk. A woman might wear a broad-brimmed straw hat at a march, decorated with purple ribbon and white flowers, signaling her loyalty without uttering a word. Milliners, ever attuned to profit, noticed the trend and began offering hats that incorporated suffragette colors. Some shops even advertised them outright, knowing their customers wanted to combine style with solidarity. Buying such a hat was a statement of both taste and political allegiance, a way to wear activism without breaking the Edwardian demand for decorum. But there was a balancing act. Too flamboyant a hat risked reinforcing stereotypes of frivolity, silly women playing dress-up instead of engaging in serious politics. Too plain a hat, however, stripped away the respectability needed to win over middle-class observers. The sweet spot was fashionable but not excessive, proper but not meek. It was a tightrope act, and suffragettes walked it with feathers pinned firmly in place. Hats also offered practical uses in the rough-and-tumble world of activism. Marches could turn chaotic, with jeering crowds, police interference, or sudden scuffles. A sturdy hat with a well-secured hatpin became a surprising defensive tool. Stories circulated of women fending off hecklers with a sharp jab of steel. Though newspapers dramatized these incidents, they added to the suffragette mystique. Stylish, yes, but don't get too close. The hat also functioned as a prop in propaganda. Suffragette postcards and posters often depicted neatly dressed women in fashionable hats, holding banners or distributing pamphlets. The visual contrast was deliberate. It challenged the notion that activists were ragged radicals, and instead presented them as ordinary women, mothers, daughters, wives, who simply wanted a political voice. The hat framed them not as outsiders, but as rightful members of polite society demanding inclusion. This strategy worked both ways. Opponents of the movement often seized on hats as symbols of hypocrisy. They mocked suffragettes for wearing fine clothes while demanding equality, as if one couldn't wear ostrich plumes and demand justice at the same time. Satirical cartoons showed women balancing absurdly large hats while shouting for votes, the implication being that their priorities were skewed. Suffragettes, however, turned the mockery back on itself. If society insisted on judging them by hats, they would use hats to prove they belonged. For working-class suffragettes, the picture was more complicated. Many couldn't afford the elaborate millinery of their wealthier allies. Still, they understood the importance of presentation. Even a modest bonnet or simple straw hat, kept neat and decorated with a ribbon in suffragette colors, carried symbolic weight. It said, "I may not be rich, but I am respectable, and my demand for the vote is no less valid." In this way, hats united women across class lines, creating a shared visual identity that transcended differences. One could argue that hats were as crucial as banners in suffragette marches. A banner declared demands, a hat declared credibility. Without the right headwear, a protest might be dismissed as a rabble. With it, the same protest could be seen as a parade of proper, determined citizens. The difference was perception, and in Edwardian society, perception was everything. Looking back, the suffragette hat statement was more than a quirk of fashion. It was a tactical masterpiece. These women understood that image, and respectability were as important as rhetoric. Their hats were shields against ridicule, signals of unity, and even tools of defense when things got ugly. In a society where women's appearances were constantly scrutinized, suffragettes turned scrutiny into strategy. They didn't abandon fashion, they weaponized it. So the next time you see a photograph of Edwardian suffragettes marching with plumes fluttering and brims shading determined faces, remember, those weren't just hats. They were arguments in fabric and feather, declarations of both femininity and defiance. Behind every chant of votes for women was the silent message of a carefully chosen hat. We belong here, and we will be seen. Among all the trimmings and flourishes of Edwardian hats, few details carried as much intrigue as the veil. A wisp of netting or lace attached to the brim could transform a hat from ordinary fashion into a statement of elegance, modesty, or mischief. Veils were the Edwardian accessory that whispered instead of shouted. They softened faces, hinted at secrets, and gave women a subtle advantage in the theatre of social interaction. Veils, perfect for hiding both your face and your disdain for boring conversation. At their simplest, veils were practical. Edwardian cities were hardly paragons of cleanliness. London's streets were a cocktail of horse manure, coal smoke, dust, and the occasional projectile from a passing carriage. A veil acted as a filter, literally. Women walking the streets could keep grime, soot, and insects from smacking directly into their faces. In this sense, a veil was a bit like an early air pollution mask, but infinitely more fashionable. Imagine peering through lace while navigating smog that turned white dresses grey by the end of the day. But veils weren't just about practicality. They were about symbolism. In Edwardian culture, a veil conveyed modesty. It suggested that a woman was refined, dignified, and perhaps just a little untouchable. A veil over the eyes softened sharp features, blurring imperfections in an era obsessed with appearances. And in the harsh daylight of garden parties or promenades, it created a flattering haze, making every complexion look smoother than it really was. Think of it as Edwardian Photoshop, gauzy, portable, and pinned to your hat. Veils also had a powerful allure. In Edwardian literature and art, veiled women often carried an air of mystery. A half-hidden face invited curiosity. The glimpse of an eye behind netting was more tantalizing than a fully revealed expression. For young women, this played perfectly into the games of flirtation. You could bat your eyelashes dramatically from behind a veil, turning the simplest glance into an act of theatre. Men who were accustomed to a society of strict boundaries found veils maddeningly enticing. They suggested intimacy while maintaining distance, a promise and a barrier in one. At the same time, veils communicated status. The quality of the fabric, the fineness of the netting, and the embellishments stitched into its edge all revealed the wearer's wealth. A cheap veil might sag or obscure the face too heavily. A finely made one draped like mist and allowed just the right amount of light through. Some were decorated with embroidered dots, flowers, or delicate trims that signaled the hand of an expensive milliner. Wearing a veil wasn't just a matter of taste, it was an investment. Different occasions demanded different veil styles. At funerals, veils became long, heavy, and somber, often covering the entire face down to the chin. They were symbols of mourning, privacy, and grief, announcing to the world that the wearer was not to be disturbed. In contrast, at weddings, veils took on the opposite symbolism, purity and transition, shrouding the bride until she was revealed at the altar. For everyday wear, shorter veils attached to hats were common, usually falling just to the nose or lips. These were practical enough for walking in the city but still glamorous enough for a social call. But veils could also be social weapons. In crowded theatres or promenades, A veil allowed women to observe others without being fully seen themselves. Behind the mesh you could watch rivals, potential suitors, or nosy neighbors while maintaining an air of polite detachment. The veil gave women control over how much of their emotions were visible. Bored of a dull conversation? Simply lower your veil and let it obscure the look of impatience on your face. Intrigued by a stranger? A tilt of the veil could offer a hint of invitation without risking impropriety. Not everyone adored them, of course. Some critics complained that veils were deceptive, allowing women to hide wrinkles, blemishes, or even their moods. One commentator huffed that veils are but traps for the unwary male, suggesting they lured men into romances under false pretenses. Others argued that veils made communication difficult, muffling voices and concealing expressions. But perhaps that was the point. In a world where women were expected to be perpetually available for judgment, veils provided a rare shield. Fashion magazines seized on the drama of veils, publishing endless sketches of new arrangements. Should the veil fall straight or curve around the cheeks? Was dotted lace more fashionable than plain mesh? Could a veil be worn at night, or was that too mysterious? These debates fueled entire pages of commentary, turning a simple length of netting into a matter of public discourse. Milliners, for their part, loved the demand. It meant endless opportunities to upsell. The suffragette movement also recognized the power of veils. Some activists wore them deliberately during marches or rallies, using them both as protection from jeering crowds and as a way to retain an aura of dignity amidst chaos. A veiled suffragette could shout for votes and still look perfectly composed, her hat and veil framing her as a woman of both fashion and conviction. Once again, the Edwardian veil was more than fabric, it was strategy. In retrospect, veils embodied the contradictions of Edwardian society. They were about modesty, but also allure. They were practical, but also deeply impractical. They symbolized purity at weddings, grief at funerals, and flirtation on promenades. They protected women from dust and stares, but they also invited curiosity. Above all, they were proof that in Edwardian fashion nothing was ever just decorative. Every scrap of lace and netting carried meaning, expectation, and performance. So the next time you see an Edwardian portrait of a woman gazing out from behind a delicate veil, remember that gauzy fabric wasn't just softening her features, it was softening reality itself, offering her control over how the world saw her and how much of her she wanted to reveal. While Edwardian hats all shared the same DNA of feathers, ribbons, and unapologetic size, the way they were styled and what they symbolized varied dramatically depending on where you stood in the world. The three fashion capitals of the age, London, Paris, and New York, each gave their own twist to the era's millinery mania. Paris made art, New York made business, London made traffic jams of feathers. In London, hats were as much about social performance as they were about style. The city was the stage for class hierarchy, and hats played the starring role. Walk down Piccadilly or through Hyde Park on a Sunday afternoon, and you'd find hats as dense as the smog, great wide brims trimmed with ostrich plumes, artificial roses or entire lace gardens swaying with every step. London hats were less about subtlety and more about spectacle, particularly at events like Ascot. Here the rules were clear. Your hat should announce your social standing from 50 feet away. If it blocked someone else's view, all the better. Edwardian London was built for display. Wide boulevards, department store windows, theatres and hats became the architecture of personal presence. Yet London had a curious contradiction. It prized extravagance, but it also demanded etiquette. A hat that went too far into absurdity risked ridicule. This gave rise to a kind of competitive conservatism, where milliners and their clients danced on the edge of boldness, while never straying too far from what the Queen or leading society ladies deemed acceptable. London's hats were not art for art's sake. They were badges of belonging, coded signals in the language of class. If Paris flirted with radical creativity, London politely leaned back, adjusted its feathers and insisted on decorum. Just very large, very visible decorum. Paris, on the other hand, treated hats as works of art. If London's hats were social uniforms, Paris's were masterpieces. Parisian milliners like Caroline Reboux and Jean Paquin turned hats into sculptures of fabric and plume, emphasizing innovation and elegance. Paris didn't just follow trends, it set them. The city's ateliers were laboratories of experimentation, producing daring shapes, delicate veils, and bold color palettes that filtered into the rest of the world. French hats often carried a lighter touch compared to London's heavy grandeur. The French adored balance and harmony, plumes that curved gracefully, flowers placed just so, ribbons arranged like brushstrokes on a canvas. The effect was theatrical, yes, but controlled. Parisian women treated their hats as an extension of their personal style, not just as status symbols. A Parisian hat could whisper sophistication rather than shout wealth, and in doing so it captured the essence of French chic. Fashion magazines adored Paris, treating its milliners like celebrities. Sketches of new Parisian designs crossed the Channel and the Atlantic, sparking copycats in London and New York within weeks. To say your hat was from Paris was to say it carried the official stamp of taste. Even if it had been copied cheaply in a backroom millinery shop in Manchester, the mere association elevated it. Paris didn't just influence fashion, it dominated it. Meanwhile, New York approached hats with a distinctly American flair, practical ambition mixed with brash scale. By the Edwardian era, New York had emerged as a global economic powerhouse, and its fashion followed suit. Women in Manhattan wanted hats that made statements as bold as the city itself. Brims were broad, plumes were high, and decoration often leaned toward the dramatic. But unlike Paris, where hats were about artistry, or London, where they were about hierarchy, New York hats were about confidence. They were urban billboards of personality, striding down Fifth Avenue or gliding into grand hotels. New York's millinery industry boomed thanks to mass production. While Parisian ateliers produced high art, New York factories churned out stylish, affordable imitations that middle-class women could buy in department stores like Macy's. The result was a democratization of fashion. Women from a wide range of backgrounds could participate in the hat craze, each selecting something within her budget but still on trend. A secretary might wear a trimmed felt hat to work, while a society matron wore a Paris import to the opera, but both belonged to the same conversation of fashion. At the same time, New York's hats carried the brashness of a city less bound by aristocratic tradition. Where London whispered about propriety, New York shouted about presence. Hats were part of the city's energy, flamboyant, quick-changing, and not afraid of excess. If a London lady feared standing out for the wrong reasons, her New York counterpart reveled in being noticed. The interplay between these three cities created a global fashion ecosystem. Paris innovated, London codified, and New York amplified. A daring new style unveiled in a Paris salon would be adapted for respectability in London drawing rooms, then mass-produced for American department stores within months. Fashion was international gossip in textile form, with hats as its juiciest topic. Of course, there was rivalry. London society women sniffed at New York's gaudy imitations. Americans, in turn, mocked the British for clinging to aristocratic codes instead of embracing modernity. Paris, meanwhile, rolled its eyes at both, confident in its role as the eternal arbiter of taste. Yet for all their differences, the three cities fed off each other, ensuring that Edwardian hats reached a level of creativity and cultural dominance the world had never seen. Looking back, the regional flavors of millinery show how much hats were more than decoration. They were cultural mirrors. London's hats reflected hierarchy and order. Paris's reflected artistry and innovation. New York's reflected ambition and accessibility. Together, they made the Edwardian hat craze not just a local obsession, but a global phenomenon. In Edwardian society, people didn't stumble into fashion trends by accident. They were pushed, nudged, and sometimes smothered under the weight of advertising. The Edwardians lived in a golden age of print culture, when newspapers, illustrated weeklies, and glossy magazines turned consumerism into an art form. And if there was one item that print loved to glamorize, it was the hat. Edwardian Vogue wasn't about skincare, it was about hat care. At the dawn of the 20th century, advertising itself was undergoing a transformation. Gone were the days of simple notices listing goods and prices. Now, ads were spectacles filled with seductive language, artistic illustrations and promises of transformation. Hat ads didn't just sell fabric and feathers. They sold elegance, respectability, and the illusion of belonging to high society. A well-placed illustration in the lady's pictorial, or the Queen could make a new brim shape or ribbon colour. The talk of tea tables from London to Manchester. The power of print magazines was enormous. Titles like Vogue, which began in the 1890s, every issue featured pages of sketches showing the latest millinery creations, often imported from Paris, complete with breathless descriptions. A charming confection of lilac silk, trimmed with ostrich plumes and chiffon, ideal for spring promenades. Readers weren't just informed, they were enchanted. These illustrations turned hats into fantasies, and women into heroines who might achieve those fantasies if only they bought the right creation. Advertisements also targeted specific aspirations. For the ambitious middle class, hats symbolized upward mobility, and ads promised just that. A Paris look at an English price boasted one department store campaign, reassuring customers that they too could walk the streets looking like duchesses without actually possessing a duchess's income. For wealthier clients, the message shifted. Exclusivity. Ads whispered about imported fabrics, rare plumes, and limited designs that only a select few could afford. Whether you were climbing or already perched on top, the advertising spoke directly to your insecurities and ambitions. The artwork itself was part of the allure. These weren't crude sketches, they were lush, elegant illustrations, often painted by skilled artists. Women were drawn with impossibly long necks, tiny waists, and serene faces, their hats floating like halos. The hats themselves seemed weightless, despite in reality being large enough to shade half a garden party. The trick was aspiration. The illustrations created an ideal that reality could never quite match. Women saw not just a hat but the version of themselves they longed to be. Even men were roped into the millinery marketing machine. Ads for bowler and top hats emphasized professionalism, trustworthiness, and success. "The hat of the reliable gentleman," one tagline read, suggesting that a simple accessory could prove one's moral character. A shiny topper wasn't just fashion, it was evidence that you belonged in the boardroom. Men's ads lacked the frills and flourishes of women's, but they leaned heavily on the same psychological tricks. Buy this, and you'll be the man everyone respects. Department stores seized on advertising as their main weapon. Harrods, Selfridges, and Liberties filled papers with announcements of new arrivals from Paris and Ascot specials. The timing was deliberate. Weeks before major social events, pages were saturated with images of seasonal hats, ensuring women would feel compelled to purchase something new. It was the Edwardian version of seasonal drops, a never-ending cycle designed to keep consumers hungry. Then there were the catalogues, thick, beautifully printed booklets mailed to customers across Britain and even overseas. These catalogues allowed women in small towns or colonies to browse the latest trends without ever stepping foot in a London salon. The images made the world feel smaller, turning the fashion capitals into accessible fantasies. A housewife in Yorkshire might never attend Ascot, but she could still own a hat advertised as Ascot-inspired. Advertising shrank distances, democratized desire, and ensured the hat craze reached every corner of the Edwardian world. Of course, satire followed closely on advertising's heels. Critics mocked the hyperbolic language that promised transformation through millinery. One magazine quipped that a new hat may not guarantee virtue, but it will certainly suggest it. Others joked that advertisements were less about the hats and more about flattering the buyers' egos. Still, the ridicule did little to slow the tide. The more people laughed, the more they read, and the more hats they bought. There was also an undercurrent of pressure. These glossy pages didn't just inspire, they demanded. Women leafing through a magazine couldn't help but compare their current hat to the illustrated fantasies staring back at them. Suddenly, last season's hat felt tired, shabby, even embarrassing. Advertising thrived on this discomfort. The constant stream of latest styles kept consumers trapped in a cycle of dissatisfaction. What was fashionable in May was passé by September, and the ads were ready to remind you. Looking back, the Edwardian advertising machine feels startlingly modern. Its strategies, aspiration, exclusivity, anxiety, repetition, remain the backbone of marketing today. Hats were the perfect product to exploit. Highly visible, socially loaded, and endlessly variable, print turned them into objects of desire, not through logic, but through dreams. So while Edwardian women perched enormous gardens and aviaries on their heads, it was the world of advertising that made sure they did so again and again, season after season. The magazines sold more than hats. They sold the promise of beauty, respectability, and social success, all for the price of a ribbon and a few ostrich feathers. And if you think that sounds familiar, it should. Swap the feathers for handbags or sneakers, and you'll see that the Edwardians invented modern marketing one illustrated brim at a time. If there was one truth in Edwardian fashion, it was this: your rent was optional, your hat budget was not. Hats weren't just frivolous adornments, they were full-blown financial commitments, draining wallets with the same relentlessness as landlords, and often with better results. For Edwardian women, a hat wasn't simply clothing, it was an investment in social survival. The cost started with materials, and oh, were they extravagant. Silk, velvet, and fine straw made up the bases, each demanding a different price tier. The finest straw, imported from Italy, could drive up costs before a single plume or ribbon was even added. Velvet and silk, meanwhile, weren't just fabrics but status signals, shimmering under gaslight or sunlight with an unmistakable richness. Cheap alternatives existed, of course, but they carried the risk of being spotted instantly as inferior, and nothing screamed social death quite like an obviously budget-conscious bonnet. Then came the trimmings. Ribbons and lace were the gateway drugs of millinery spending, small, decorative, and deceptively addictive. A lady could walk into a department store intending to buy a modest hat and leave having spent twice as much once she added a few extra yards of imported French ribbon. Flowers. Silk, waxed or dried, were another staple. A spray of artificial roses could double the price of a hat, not because of their practicality, they wilted if it rained, but because they suggested freshness and femininity. But the real financial killer? Feathers. Ostrich plumes were the Bitcoin of Edwardian millinery, wildly valuable, fiercely traded, and prone to dramatic price spikes. A single luxurious plume could cost the equivalent of several weeks' wages for a working-class woman. And that's not even counting rarer feathers. Egret feathers, often poached at the expense of entire bird populations, were so valuable they were locked in display cases like jewels. Wearing one wasn't just fashion, it was flaunting a mini fortune on your head. A hat with a full spread of exotic plumes could rival the cost of a month's rent in a respectable neighborhood. Milliners themselves contributed to the inflation. A custom-made hat from a respected milliner wasn't priced merely on materials but on artistry. Clients weren't just buying fabric and feathers, they were buying exclusivity, the assurance that no other woman at the garden party would appear in the same creation. The labor was intensive, cutting, shaping, steaming, wiring, and sewing, often by hand. Behind every finished piece were hours of unseen work, and that craftsmanship didn't come cheap. For the upper classes, spending lavishly on hats was expected, even applauded. A woman who turned up in last season's bonnet might as well have worn a sign reading, "My husband's business is failing." Millinery bills for aristocratic households could soar into the hundreds of pounds annually, a staggering sum at the time, easily equivalent to thousands today. This spending wasn't considered wasteful, it was necessary to maintain one's place in the social pecking order. The bigger the hat budget, the sturdier the family's reputation. The middle class, however, bore the real burden. Eager to imitate the aristocracy, but without limitless funds, they often stretched themselves dangerously thin to keep up. Magazines tantalized them with sketches of Parisian confections, and department stores offered payment plans or cheaper imitations. But even these affordable hats represented significant sacrifices. Many households had to adjust budgets, cutting corners on food, clothing, or even rent, to ensure that the lady of the house could present herself properly hatted. After all, what good was a respectable home if its mistress was seen hatless on the high street? Working-class women weren't immune either. Even though practicality dictated simpler styles, the pressure to look respectable in public forced many to purchase at least one decent hat, often saved for Sundays or special outings. These hats were cherished possessions, guarded carefully, and worn until they literally fell apart. For them, the purchase of a hat wasn't about extravagance, but survival in a society where appearances shaped opportunities. A worn or shabby hat could mean being judged as careless, slovenly, or undeserving of respect. Men, too, faced financial expectations, though in more restrained forms. A gentleman's top hat or bowler wasn't cheap, and keeping it polished and in good condition required its own set of expenses. But compared to women's millinery bills, male hat costs were pocket change. While men might grumble about the price of their wives' latest purchases, they were often complicit, understanding that a fashionable wife was part of maintaining the family's image. Complaints about millinery madness filled newspapers, but few husbands dared cut their wives' hat budgets entirely. It would have been social suicide for both. The economics of Edwardian hats reveal a cycle of constant spending. Unlike jewelry or gowns that might last for years, hats had short lifespans in the whirlwind of fashion. A brim shape that was all the rage one season was passé the next. New colors, trimmings, and silhouettes rolled out with relentless speed, driven by advertising and fashion leaders. To keep up, women bought and bought again, feeding an industry that thrived on obsolescence. Critics at the time saw the absurdity. Satirical magazines published cartoons of families starving while the mother proudly displayed her latest hat, or of milliners cackling as they emptied customers' purses. Yet the cycle endured. Why? Because in Edwardian society, a hat wasn't optional. It was as essential as shoes, as scrutinized as a handshake, and as symbolic as a wedding ring. The costs may have been staggering, but the alternative, being seen as unfashionable, careless, or out of touch, was worse. Looking back, it's easy to laugh at the financial insanity of spending a month's rent on a pile of plumes and ribbons. But the truth is, Edwardian hats were never just things. They were investments in status, tools of social negotiation, and symbols of identity. And for that, people paid whatever it took. Traveling in the Edwardian era was already a test of patience. Long train rides, crowded steamships, and carriages rattling over cobblestones. But if you added a fashionable Edwardian hat to the mix, the ordeal multiplied tenfold. Hats weren't just fragile, they were massive, elaborate, and prone to crushing under the slightest pressure. Forget packing light. Your hat box needed its own ticket. A typical Edwardian woman didn't own just one or two hats. She owned dozens: morning hats, afternoon hats, church hats, travel hats, and special pieces for events like Ascot. This meant that even the simplest trip could quickly turn into a logistical nightmare. A weekend at a country house required at least 4 or 5 hats, each carefully chosen for the right social occasion. A longer voyage, say across the Atlantic to New York, demanded a veritable parade of millinery, sometimes upwards of a dozen hats. After all, one couldn't possibly appear at a shipboard dinner in the same hat worn during a morning promenade on deck. The horror. Thus the hat box became an essential piece of Edwardian luggage. These weren't dainty cases. They were enormous, round, and sometimes bigger than the women carrying them. A proper hat box was stiff-sided, often made of leather or wood, lined with soft fabric to protect delicate trims. Inside, hats were nestled in tissue paper, sometimes padded with small pillows to keep brims from bending. Wealthier travelers might even have custom-fitted boxes, with compartments for feathers, veils, and ribbons to be adjusted en route. These boxes were so bulky they could rival a trunk, yet they were devoted to nothing but fragile piles of silk and feathers. Porters despised them. Imagine trying to stack neat rows of square trunks in a railway carriage or ship's hold. only to be confronted with giant circular hat boxes rolling around like runaway wheels. They didn't fit, they didn't stack, and they always seemed to need special handling. For women, this was yet another expense. Tips for porters who were bribed to be careful, or repairs when careless handling left hats crushed and mangled. Complaints of ruined hats on trains were so common that newspapers occasionally published letters from furious ladies demanding better service. To destroy a hat was practically to commit social sabotage. Travel itself created endless comedy. On crowded trains, women wearing large hats often struggled to fit comfortably into compartments. Brims collided with neighboring passengers, feathers poked strangers in the face, and veils tangled in luggage racks. Fellow passengers grumbled about those dreadful hats, but etiquette demanded women keep them on, at least until safely at their destination. To remove one mid-journey was considered undignified, and besides, where would you put it? Hats weren't designed to be squashed onto laps like today's sun hats. They were fragile, architectural things that needed space, and Edwardian trains rarely offered it. Steamships magnified the challenge. The wealthy crossing the Atlantic brought entire wardrobes, and millinery cases were among the most troublesome pieces of luggage. Hat boxes filled cabins, cluttered decks, and overwhelmed staff. Wealthier ladies solved the problem by bringing maids whose sole task was to manage their millinery. These long-suffering attendants fluffed feathers, straightened ribbons, and performed emergency hat surgery after a rough crossing. Less fortunate travelers had to manage their own hats, carefully juggling them through customs halls and shipboard promenades, praying that no stray gust of sea air would undo their efforts. Early motorcars, another Edwardian novelty, created their own dramas. Hats were practically allergic to open-air driving. One sharp acceleration, and plumes whipped violently, veils slapped across faces, and entire hats threatened to launch into the countryside. Women invented motoring veils, long scarves wrapped tightly over both hat and face to prevent catastrophe. But even these were stopgap solutions. Car rides often ended with hair tangled, veils askew, and hats barely clinging on. A journey might begin with elegance and conclude with the look of someone who had been through a wind tunnel. The hat box became such a symbol of Edwardian travel that it entered popular satire. Cartoons depicted harried husbands staggering under mountains of circular boxes, while their wives glided serenely behind, parasols in hand. Travel guides offered tongue-in-cheek advice on how many hat boxes were reasonable, though the answer was always fewer than women wanted, more than men tolerated. The cultural joke became shorthand for Edwardian extravagance. Why carry 2 trunks when you could carry 5 trunks and 6 hat boxes? Of course, not all women travelled with towering hat wardrobes. Middle-class ladies often limited themselves to 1 or 2 versatile hats, sometimes trimmed differently depending on the occasion. Some milliners even offered convertible hats, basic shapes with interchangeable ribbons or flowers that could be restyled on the go. It was a practical solution, though one often sniffed at by the wealthy, who equated retrimming with cutting corners. Still, for many women it was the only way to balance fashion demands with the realities of rail tickets and cramped cabins. Despite the inconvenience, hats were non-negotiable. No respectable Edwardian woman would dare arrive at a country weekend, a seaside resort, or a transatlantic ship without her hats. To show up bareheaded or worse, with a crumpled, neglected hat, was to invite whispers about your manners, your finances, and even your character. The hat box, for all its awkwardness, was a passport to social credibility. Looking back, the logistical headache of transporting hats reveals just how much power they held in Edwardian life. Entire industries of luggage makers, porters, and milliners catered to this one accessory, proving that a simple piece of headwear could shape how people traveled, packed, and even joked about fashion. Hats didn't just sit on heads, they demanded their own seats, their own trunks, and their own slice of Edwardian travel culture. So next time you grumble about airline baggage fees, spare a thought for the Edwardian lady boarding a train with 3 hat boxes, a maid, and a plume taller than the luggage rack. She wasn't just carrying hats. She was carrying her identity, her respectability, and a few £100 worth of feathers all in a box that refused to fit anywhere. When we think of Edwardian hats, we picture towering creations draped in ribbons, blossoms, and especially feathers, those fluttering symbols of elegance and extravagance. But beneath the shimmer and fluff lay a devastating truth. The millinery craze came at a staggering environmental price. Entire species vanished so someone could look fabulous at brunch. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw an insatiable demand for feathers. Ostrich plumes, egret sprays, heron crests, hummingbird wings. If it could fly, it could be plucked, dried and sewn onto a hat. Milliners didn't just dabble in feathers, they devoured them. A fashionable lady's brim could carry enough plumage to outfit an aviary, and no amount of bird life seemed too rare or too exotic. The impact was catastrophic. Consider the egret, whose delicate white breeding plumes called aigrettes were among the most coveted hat trims of the Edwardian age. These plumes could only be harvested during mating season, when the birds produced their most ornate feathers. Hunters slaughtered adults by the thousands, leaving chicks to starve in nests. Swamps and wetlands across Florida and South America were littered with abandoned chicks, their parents' feathers now parading down London's Bond Street or Paris's Rue de la Paix. And it wasn't just egrets. The snowy heron, the bird of paradise, grebes, and even hummingbirds were driven to the brink. The hummingbird craze saw tiny corpses dried whole and used as hat decorations. Sometimes entire birds, wings spread, perched on the side of a bonnet like a macabre brooch. It was less millinery and more ornithological apocalypse. The numbers were staggering. By some estimates, millions of birds were killed annually to satisfy the feather trade. In 1902 alone, London's feather auctions sold nearly 190,000 packages of exotic plumes, enough to fill warehouses. Traders boasted of imports from Africa, South America, India, and the Pacific, each shipment a grim reminder that hats were driving global biodiversity into crisis. Feathers weren't just fashion, they were an international commodity, more expensive by weight than gold. Ostriches, curiously, were one of the few birds to survive the craze relatively intact. Unlike delicate songbirds, ostriches could be farmed, and their plumes harvested without killing the bird. This created a booming ostrich farming industry in South Africa, where ranchers treated the birds as living feather factories. It was brutal but sustainable compared to the wholesale slaughter of wild species. Unfortunately, the same could not be said for egrets or paradise birds, which faced relentless hunting until their populations collapsed. The environmental carnage didn't go unnoticed. Naturalists and animal lovers began sounding alarms. In Britain and the United States, conservationists launched campaigns against the plume trade, arguing that women's fashion was destroying ecosystems. The Audubon Society, founded in 1905, became a leading voice, publishing gruesome reports and photographs of bird colonies devastated by plume hunters. They urged women to abandon feathered hats in favor of more humane alternatives. The debate reached Parliament and Congress, where legislators clashed over whether fashion justified mass extinction. Supporters of the trade dismissed conservationists as sentimentalists, insisting that feathers were an economic necessity, employing thousands in the millinery industry. Critics, however, countered that no amount of employment justified wiping out species for adornment. The clash between profit and preservation was as fierce as any Edwardian duel, only fought in print, speeches, and society clubs rather than with pistols at dawn. Women themselves became central to the fight. Some proudly rejected plumes, adopting the so-called Audubon hat, plain and unadorned, as a statement of conscience. Others defended their right to fashion, insisting that beauty and elegance required sacrifice, though conveniently not their own. The suffragette movement occasionally overlapped with conservation campaigns, with activists pointing out that the feather trade exploited both women and birds, women as consumers pressured into endless spending, birds as raw materials annihilated for profit. But satire thrived alongside activism. Cartoons lampooned women whose hats sprouted entire menageries, owls, roosters, even storks, mocking the absurdity of turning living creatures into mere trimmings. One image showed a lady wearing a brim so laden with stuffed birds that it resembled a traveling aviary. Humor exposed the grotesque truth. What looked elegant from afar often looked monstrous up close. Despite the criticism, the feather trade was slow to decline. Fashion is stubborn, and vanity often outweighs conscience. Even after conservation laws began appearing in the 1910s, smuggling and illegal hunting continued. Bird populations had already been decimated, and some species never fully recovered. The great auk, once slaughtered for food and feathers, vanished completely by mid-century. Others, like certain types of egrets and grebes, survived only because conservationists finally managed to sway public opinion. Looking back, the environmental cost of Edwardian hats is a reminder that fashion isn't harmless. Those elegant photographs of women in sweeping plumed brims hide a darker history. Wetlands emptied of herons, jungles silenced of songbirds, and ecosystems upended so that someone could sip tea under a feathered crown. The Edwardians may not have seen extinction as a consequence of fashion, but we do, and it casts their elegance in a more sinister light. Yet their excess also gave birth to something important. Outrage over the millinery trade helped launch modern conservation movements. The Audubon Society, wildlife protection laws, and early environmental awareness all owe part of their origins to the fight over feathers. In an odd way, the very hats that nearly destroyed bird populations also inspired people to start protecting nature. So yes, Edwardian women strutted into brunch looking magnificent, their heads crowned with plumes that once graced distant skies, but every feather carried a ghost. Entire species paid the price so that one society lady could bask in compliments. In the end, the Edwardian hat craze didn't just change fashion, it changed the world's relationship with wildlife, forcing humanity to reckon with the true cost of looking fabulous. By the height of the Edwardian era, hats had transformed from fashion statements into avian graveyards. Feathers, wings, and entire stuffed birds perched on brims made women look like they were hosting a wildlife convention on their heads. But while society cooed over plumes, a different kind of movement was stirring. Early conservationists began to argue that the craze for feathers wasn't just unsightly, it was catastrophic. They weren't just saving birds, they were trying to stop hats from becoming small ecosystems. The Humane movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries grew out of broader campaigns for animal welfare. Groups like the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds (RSPB), founded in 1889, and the Audubon Society in the United States, founded in 1905, became the loudest voices against plume hunting. Their founders, often women themselves, were appalled by the carnage of the feather trade. They saw wetlands stripped of life, tropical forests plundered, and entire bird colonies destroyed for the sake of fashion, and they made it their mission to stop the slaughter. Their strategy wasn't just moral outrage, it was storytelling. Activists published graphic accounts of chicks starving after hunters shot parent birds for their decorative feathers. They circulated photographs of plume hunters posing proudly beside piles of dead herons, and they described in excruciating detail the methods used to rip the coveted plumes from carcasses. These vivid depictions shocked polite society. Suddenly, that jaunty egret spray didn't look so charming when you knew it had been torn from a breeding bird while its chicks cried in vain. The movement was particularly effective because it appealed directly to women, the very consumers driving the demand. Campaigners weren't shy about shaming them. Pamphlets bore titles like "Murderous Millinery" and asked women pointedly, "Would you wear a hat trimmed with cruelty?" The message was clear: every plume on your bonnet carried the price of suffering. For some women, this was enough to spark a change. For others, it became a fashionable badge of moral superiority to eschew feathers altogether. Plumeless hats gained a small but growing following, worn proudly by those who wanted to display not just taste but conscience. Of course, the movement had its critics. Milliners and hunters pushed back, claiming that the trade supported livelihoods and that conservationists exaggerated the scale of destruction. Fashion journals mocked the plumeless brigade as dowdy and humorless. But the Humane movement had something fashion couldn't easily counter: momentum. By 1900, the RSPB had tens of thousands of members, mostly women, who lobbied tirelessly for legal bans on the feather trade. In Britain, these efforts bore fruit. Laws were introduced to restrict the import of certain plumes, and public opinion began to shift. What once symbolized elegance now increasingly suggested cruelty. The United States followed a similar path. The Audubon Society spearheaded campaigns that culminated in the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, which outlawed the hunting of many bird species for fashion. It was one of the earliest and most significant victories for wildlife conservation, born directly from outrage over hats. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Humane movement was its female leadership. In an era when women were excluded from politics and often dismissed in public life, these activists carved out a space for themselves. Fighting for birds gave them a socially acceptable cause, but it also taught them how to organize, lobby, and wield influence. In some ways, the feather controversy was a rehearsal for larger political battles like women's suffrage. It turned out that saving birds and winning votes weren't so different. Both required persistence, alliances, and a willingness to challenge entrenched interests. The moral rhetoric was often clever, even theatrical. Campaigners compared feathered hats to crowns of death, accusing wearers of turning themselves into walking cemeteries. They hosted exhibitions of murderous millinery, displaying hats alongside dead specimens to shock viewers into reconsidering their choices. Some sermons even declared feather-wearing a sin, equating vanity with violence. By reframing fashion as cruelty, the Humane movement stripped hats of their innocence. Still, the battle was slow. Feathered hats remained popular well into the 1910s, especially among the wealthy. But seeds had been planted. Increasingly, women began to favor ribbons, lace, or fabric flowers over endangered bird parts. Milliners, under pressure, shifted toward more sustainable trimmings, or at least tried to disguise real feathers as something artificial. Change didn't happen overnight, but by the time World War I arrived, priorities had shifted. Practicality, rationing, and new roles for women in the workforce diminished the appetite for extravagant plumage. The Humane movement had helped set the stage for this transition. In hindsight, the rise of the Humane movement is one of the most fascinating aspects of Edwardian fashion history. It shows how a seemingly frivolous accessory could spark one of the first global conservation campaigns. Hats weren't just fashion, they were flashpoints for ethics, economy, and environmental awareness. And for once, the moralists won. Bird populations, though scarred, slowly recovered thanks to new protections. So the next time you look at a picture of a woman in a vast Edwardian hat, remember the other story, the one told by activists who fought to keep those feathers on living wings instead of decorating someone's tea time ensemble. In the end, hats may have nearly wiped out species, but they also ignited the earliest sparks of modern conservation. The fight against murderous millinery proved that sometimes even fashion could change the world. Every fashion empire eventually topples, and the Edwardian hat craze was no exception. What had once been an era of feathers, towering brims, and architectural millinery entered its slow decline with the arrival of World War I. The world no longer had time for flamboyant hats that blocked train aisles or threatened to take flight in a stiff breeze. When shells are falling, you stop worrying if your brim is wide enough. The war disrupted every aspect of life, and fashion was no exception. Materials once abundant for milliners, silk, velvet, and imported feathers, suddenly became scarce. Shipping routes were redirected to military supply, not fashion goods, and importing exotic plumes from South America or Africa seemed frivolous when soldiers needed boots and blankets. The global feather trade, which had once supported entire industries, staggered under rationing and economic uncertainty. Hats didn't disappear, but they shrank, literally and figuratively. Practicality took over. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, filling roles in factories, offices, and hospitals. Huge brims dripping with feathers were useless on a munitions line or in a crowded tram. Smaller, sturdier hats became the norm, trim felt cloches, neat turbans, or modest straw caps that could be worn comfortably while working. These hats weren't about flaunting wealth, they were about staying out of the way while still maintaining a touch of style. The age of the hat as a flamboyant stage prop was ending, replaced by an era of efficiency. The cultural mood had shifted too. Edwardian extravagance had thrived in a world obsessed with appearances and leisure. War brought austerity, grief, and a demand for seriousness. It felt almost obscene to parade in hats covered with plumes while men died on the front lines. Society turned against ostentation. What once symbolized elegance now risked looking tone-deaf. Women who continued to wear oversized creations faced not admiration but scorn. A wide brim no longer announced status, it announced detachment from reality. At the same time, political winds were changing. The suffragette movement gained momentum during and after the war, with women proving their capability in roles previously reserved for men. As women demanded more rights, their fashions followed suit. Hats became less about impressing at garden parties, and more about complementing practical clothing designed for mobility and work. The smaller, close-fitting hats of the 1920s reflected this transformation. Modern, forward-looking, and less tethered to the whims of aristocratic society, milliners themselves struggled to adapt. Shops that once made fortunes selling Ascot confections now had to pivot towards simpler designs. Some embraced it, crafting sleek, affordable hats for working women. Others resisted, clinging to the fantasy of plumes and brims until their businesses faltered. The collapse of the extravagant hat wasn't just a fashion story, it was an economic reckoning. The vast networks of feather hunters, ribbon importers, and trimming workshops dwindled, casualties of a world that no longer prioritized flamboyant headwear. Magazines also reflected the shift. The glossy illustrations that once showcased enormous hats dripping with flora and fauna gave way to more subdued spreads. Sketches in Vogue and Harper's Bazaar showed cloche hats and headscarves paired with shorter skirts and tailored jackets. The imagery was modern, clean, and efficient, an aesthetic that matched the mood of post-war society. For many women it was liberating. The disappearance of enormous hats meant less expense, less hassle, and more freedom. That's not to say hats vanished overnight. They remained essential to social respectability, especially in public, but their cultural dominance waned. They no longer dictated an entire industry of global bird hunting, nor did they consume half a household's discretionary income. The hat became a complement to fashion, not its centerpiece. In this sense, the war didn't destroy hats, it humbled them. There was also a psychological aspect. After years of death and destruction, people craved simplicity. The ornate fripperies of the Edwardian years felt like relics from a vanished world, symbols of the same elites who had dragged nations into war. The new generation of women in the 1920s wasn't interested in balancing a birdcage on their heads. They wanted sleek, forward-looking fashion that reflected modernity. The cloche hat, hugging the head like a streamlined helmet of progress, was the perfect answer. It was as though women collectively decided, enough with the brims, let's start fresh. Humorists, of course, mourned the loss with jokes. Cartoons poked fun at women now risking visibility without their former veils and feathers. Men, relieved at not being jabbed by hatpins in theaters, declared victory. Satirists wrote mock obituaries for the ostrich plume, praising it for years of faithful service to vanity. Beneath the humor was relief. Society had tired of the inconvenience, the expense, and the sheer absurdity of Edwardian millinery. Looking back, the slow decline of the hat craze was more than a matter of fashion. It was a cultural pivot. The great plumed creations of the Edwardian years symbolized a world of leisure, extravagance, and rigid social codes. The smaller, simpler hats of the post-war years symbolized modernity, practicality, and change. It wasn't just hats that shrank. It was an entire worldview. The wide brim had once served as a stage for society's performances. After the war, the stage was dismantled. So yes, hats remained, but they would never again command the same scale of obsession, economy, or environmental cost. The Edwardian hat craze had soared, plumed and feathered, into the skies of extravagance, and then, under the weight of war, grief and progress, it quietly folded its wings. The Edwardian hat craze may have fluttered its last plume a century ago, but its legacy continues to perch on our heads in curious ways. Today's hats may be smaller, but the urge to turn your head into an art exhibit remains timeless. From fascinators at royal weddings to flamboyant creations at the Kentucky Derby, the ghost of Edwardian millinery still whispers through the feathers and ribbons of modern fashion. The Edwardians taught us that a hat could be more than a shield against sun or rain. It could be a social megaphone. That idea didn't vanish with World War I. Instead, it slimmed down, reshaped, and re-emerged in new contexts. The tiny fascinators worn by modern royals, for instance, may look restrained compared to their great-grandmother's feathered jungles, but the purpose is the same: visibility. A fascinator's tilt, or a flamboyant loop of fabric, ensures that, even in a sea of cameras, the wearer stands out. It's Edwardian logic in miniature. Your head is a billboard, so decorate accordingly. Events like the Kentucky Derby carry the Edwardian torch most flamboyantly. Known as the greatest 2 minutes in sports, it's also one of the greatest displays of millinery excess since Ascot in its heyday. Wide-brimmed hats festooned with flowers, feathers, and improbable color combinations dominate the stands. Attending without a hat is practically social heresy. It's Ascot reborn on American soil, proof that the desire to compete in fashion rather than racing never really left us. One suspects Edwardian racegoers would feel right at home, though perhaps mildly disappointed that no one is balancing an entire taxidermied bird anymore. The Edwardian obsession also shaped the way we think about occasion-specific headwear. Even though hats are no longer everyday essentials, they linger in ceremonial and formal contexts. Weddings, funerals, church services, and royal events often still expect some form of head adornment. The Edwardians may have codified this system so strictly that it sometimes bordered on comedy, but the echoes remain. The expectation that a hat equals respectability hasn't entirely died, it has simply become niche. Fashion designers also owe a debt to Edwardian milliners. The idea of the hat as sculptural art didn't vanish, it evolved into haute couture. Designers like Philip Treacy and Stephen Jones, whose modern creations sometimes resemble flying saucers or architectural experiments, are direct descendants of the Edwardian ethos. The head is a stage, and a hat is the performance. Where Edwardian women wore ecosystems of birds and blossoms, today's couture models balance laser-cut metals, plastics, or entire floral explosions. The materials changed, but the theatrical spirit is the same. Culturally, the Edwardian hat craze left behind both fascination and mockery. Photographs of women hidden beneath brims wider than wagon wheels elicit awe and laughter in equal measure. They remind us of a society that was at once deeply serious about appearances and profoundly absurd in execution. The humor remains irresistible. Ladies struggling to fit into carriages, men skewered by hatpins in theaters, feathers flapping into neighbors' soup bowls. The sheer impracticality is part of its enduring charm. But there's also a serious legacy. The environmental debates sparked by millinery excess planted seeds for the modern conservation movement. Organizations like the RSPB and Audubon Society began as responses to murderous millinery. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, one of the most significant pieces of conservation law, exists because Edwardian women demanded feathers. Without their extravagance and the backlash against it, conservation history might look very different. In a strange way, the Edwardian hat craze both devastated and ultimately helped preserve global bird populations. On a social level, hats symbolized identity, respectability, and status with such force that their memory still influences us. The Edwardian logic that appearances matter, that what sits on your head says who you are, never really disappeared. It simply shifted into other arenas: handbags, shoes, designer sunglasses. Where once a plume announced your wealth, now a brand logo does. Fashion always finds new battlegrounds, but the Edwardians provided the playbook. And finally, the legacy lives on in our cultural imagination. Films and period dramas love Edwardian hats because they instantly set the scene. One look at a woman struggling under an avalanche of ostrich feathers, and the viewer knows this is a world obsessed with spectacle. The hats have become shorthand for the era itself, more recognizable than corsets or tea gowns. They are icons, symbols of elegance and absurdity rolled into one. So, what do Edwardian hats leave us with today? A reminder that fashion is never just fabric. It is ambition, vanity, identity, and sometimes destruction, all stitched together and perched precariously on a head. Edwardian hats may no longer fill carriages, block theatre views, or bankrupt households, but their DNA lingers every time a royal wedding fascinates us, every time a derby crowd erupts in florals, every time we laugh at a photograph of a brim the size of a small planet. In short, the Edwardians didn't just give us hats. They gave us the idea that fashion on the head could be spectacle, satire, and self-expression all at once. And even if the feathers have molted and the veils lifted, we're still in some way walking around with their legacy perched on our brows.